Warsaw, December 1932. A small room above a government building. Outside, the city is cold and grey. Inside, three young mathematicians are staring at a machine that the German military believes is absolutely unbreakable. They would break it, and when they did, they handed the Allies a secret so powerful, so dangerous, that commanders sometimes had to let their own ships sink rather than reveal they knew. This is the story of a war fought entirely in the dark, not with tanks or bombs, but with codes, lies, and the patience to make the enemy believe something that was never true. A Spanish chicken farmer was awarded the Iron Cross by Nazi Germany for intelligence he completely fabricated. A dead body, dressed in a British uniform, carried fake invasion plans onto a beach in Spain, and Hitler believed them. And a handful of mathematicians, working in a mansion in the English countryside, read Hitler's most secret orders without him ever knowing. From the cipher rooms of Warsaw to the ghost armies of England, from turned spies who deceived the Reich to atomic secrets stolen in plain sight. The invisible war of World War II changed the outcome of battles, redirected armies, and saved or cost hundreds of thousands of lives. And most of it was hidden for decades. Some of it still is. This is 3 Hour Plus Facts about World War II spies, double agents, and deception. Chapter 1. The PYRY Handshake. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and machine oil. In a nondescript building on the outskirts of Warsaw, three young mathematicians, Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Różycki, and Henryk Zygalski, bent over tables, scattered with rotors, wiring diagrams, and sheets of intercepted German radio signals. It was December 1932, and they had just accomplished something the rest of Europe believed impossible. They had broken into the logic of the German Enigma cipher machine. The Enigma was an electromechanical device roughly the size of a portable typewriter. Press a key, an electrical current flowed through a series of rotating wheels, rotors each wired in a scrambled pattern. The current passed through three rotors, a reflector, then back through the rotors in reverse, finally illuminating a letter on a lampboard. The result was polyalphabetic substitution on an industrial scale. Each keystroke changed the internal state of the machine, creating billions of possible configurations. German military and diplomatic communications flowed through Enigma networks with the confidence that no adversary could read them. But Poland had reasons to try. Sandwiched between a rearming Germany and an unpredictable Soviet Union, Polish intelligence knew survival depended on information. The cipher bureau, Biuro Cyfru, operated under the Second Department of the Polish General Staff. Its director, Lieutenant Colonel Guido Langer, recruited mathematicians instead of linguists, a quiet revolution in cryptanalytic method. Rejewski, a graduate of Poznan University with additional study in Göttingen, arrived in 1932. He was 27 years old. Rejewski's breakthrough came through a combination of mathematical insight and espionage. French intelligence had obtained Enigma operating manuals and rotor wirings from a German traitor, Hans Thilo Schmidt, codenamed Ache. The French passed these materials to Poland. With the documents in hand, Rejewski reverse-engineered the machine's internal permutations, building equations that described rotor behavior. He exploited a vulnerability in German operating procedure, the practice of encrypting the message key twice at the start of each transmission. This repetition created patterns, characteristic chains of letters that recurred across different messages. Rejewski used permutation theory and group algebra to map those chains, determining the wiring of the rotors without ever physically possessing a machine. By early 1933, the Poles were reading German Enigma traffic. Over the next 6 years, Poland industrialized its code-breaking effort. As Germany refined Enigma, adding rotors, changing procedures, increasing complexity, the Cipher Bureau built machines to keep pace. The Bomba Kryptologiczna, designed by Rejewski in 1938, was a mechanical device employing 6 linked Enigma analogues. It tested rotor positions in parallel, cycling through possibilities at high speed until it found a configuration consistent with the intercepted key repetitions. Each bomber stood roughly a meter tall, filled a small room with the clatter of rotating drums, and could solve a day's settings in about 2 hours under ideal conditions. Poland built 6 of them, but by 1939, the situation was deteriorating. Germany introduced 2 additional rotors, expanding the number of possible rotor orders from 6 to 60. The Poles would need 60 bombi, an industrial and financial impossibility for a state bracing for invasion. Meanwhile, German signals discipline improved. The doubly encrypted message key procedure, Rejewski's original entry point, was slated for replacement. In spring 1939, Lieutenant Colonel Lange and his deputy, Major Maximilian Czenski, made a decision: share everything with the Allies. Britain and France had cryptanalytic organizations, government code and cipher school, GC and CS, at Bletchley Park, and the French 12e Bureau, but neither had broken Enigma. The Poles had a lead measured in years. If Poland fell, that lead would vanish unless transferred. On July 25, 1939, French and British cryptanalysts arrived at a secret conference site in the Kabaty Woods, south of Warsaw, near the village of Pyry. The location was a cipher bureau outpost, surrounded by pine forest, quiet and isolated. Lange and Czenski met with France's Gustave Bertrand and Britain's commander Alastair Denniston, head of GC and CS, along with Dilly Knox, one of Britain's senior codebreakers. The Poles revealed everything. Rejewski explained the mathematics. The visitors examined working replicas of Enigma machines, studied the bombi, reviewed decrypted German messages, and received documentation of methods. The British and French delegates were stunned. Denniston, a veteran cryptanalyst from World War I's Room 40, had believed Enigma unbreakable. Knox, brilliant and eccentric, had spent years pursuing the cipher without success. Now they held the solution in their hands, a gift from a nation that expected to be overrun within months. On July 26, the second day of meetings, the Poles handed over physical Enigma replicas machines built in Warsaw workshops from reverse-engineered plans. Bertrand took one to Paris. Denniston took one to London. They also received blueprints for the bomber and detailed rotor wiring charts. 5 weeks later, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The cipher teams scattered. Rejewski, Różycki, and Zygalski fled south through Romania, eventually reaching France. Lange and Czenski followed. In Paris, they joined Bertrand's intelligence station, Poste de Commandement Bruno, and continued breaking Enigma traffic as the war expanded. Meanwhile, in Britain, the materials from Pyry became the foundation for Bletchley Park's entire cryptanalytic program. Alan Turing, Gordon Welchman, and other British mathematicians built on Polish methods, designing the bombe, a descendant of the bomber that would eventually crack German naval Enigma and provide the Allies with strategic intelligence throughout the war. The cost to Poland was absolute. The Cipher Bureau's Warsaw headquarters was destroyed. Many staff members died in the invasion or later in captivity. Różycki drowned in 1942 when the ship evacuating cryptanalysts from France was torpedoed in the Mediterranean. Rejewski and Zygalski survived the war, living quietly in post-war Poland under communist rule, their contributions classified and unrecognized for decades. The British kept the story of Polish Enigma breaking secret until the 1970s, long after both Rejewski and the Cold War's first freeze had settled over Europe. But the consequence of that handshake in the woods south of Warsaw was irreversible. The Allies entered the war with a cryptanalytic advantage, a signals intelligence capability that would save convoys, expose U-boat movements, reveal German strategic intentions, and shorten the war by an estimated 2 years. And it began not with British ingenuity or French espionage alone, but with 3 Polish mathematicians, a handful of machines built in secret, and a quiet decision to pass the torch before the darkness arrived. The dust in that Warsaw apartment settled long ago. But what the Poles built in the 1930s, machinery, method, and the will to share it, became the invisible scaffolding on which the Allied victory would partly rest. Chapter 2: Deception as a Starting Gun. The border between Germany and Poland in the summer of 1939 was less a line than a held breath. Villages sat on both sides, populations mixed, old resentments nursed in quiet. Radio towers stood like steel sentries, broadcasting news and propaganda into the contested air. One of those towers, at Gleiwitz in Upper Silesia, would become the stage for a lie designed to justify invasion. The lie had a name: Unternehmen Tannenberg, Operation Tannenberg, a series of staged incidents meant to provide Germany with a casus belli, a reason for war that could be sold to both domestic and international audiences. The Gleiwitz incident, executed on the night of August 31, 1939, was the most theatrical. Alfred Naugox, an SS officer, arrived at the Gleiwitz radio station with a team of German operatives dressed in Polish military uniforms. The uniforms were authentic, taken from Polish prisoners or purchased through intelligence channels. The plan was simple: storm the station, seize the microphone, broadcast a short anti-German message in Polish, then retreat, leaving behind evidence of a Polish attack. The evidence was a dead body. The body belonged to Franciszek Honiok, a Polish-speaking German farmer from the region, arrested by the Gestapo the previous day on fabricated charges. Honiok was executed by lethal injection, dressed in Polish military clothing, and delivered to Naugox. His corpse was left at the scene, bullet wounds added post-mortem to suggest he had died in the firefight. The Germans had a name for these bodies: conserve, canned goods, human beings turned into props for propaganda. At 8 p.m. on August 31, Naugox and his team forced their way into the radio station, overpowered the staff, and broadcast a brief message in Polish, announcing that the station was in the hands of Polish freedom fighters and calling for war against Germany. The message lasted less than 4 minutes, then they fled. German police and SS units responded, found Honiok's body, photographed the scene, and notified the press. The next morning, September 1, 1939, Adolf Hitler addressed the Reichstag. He cited the Gleiwitz incident and other fabricated attacks as proof of Polish aggression, claiming Germany had no choice but to respond with force. Last night, he declared, Polish regular soldiers fired on our territory. Since 5:45 a.m. we have been returning fire. It was a lie built on a corpse, a costume, and a microphone. But the lie was not intended for historians. It was designed for the immediate moment, for domestic morale and international audiences still clinging to the hope that diplomacy might prevent war. The details would not be scrutinized until later. By the time the truth emerged through Nuremberg testimony and post-war investigations, the invasion was history, Poland occupied, and the broader war already years deep. The Gleiwitz incident demonstrated a principle that would recur throughout the war. Narrative can be a weapon. Control the story, and you control the justification. Manufacture the evidence, and you manufacture consent. The tension was not only moral, but operational once a state proved it could fabricate reality on demand. Every subsequent claim became suspect. Intelligence services on all sides learned to question not just the truth of reports, but their purpose. Was this information genuine, or was it designed to provoke, mislead, or justify? The consequences rippled outward. Germany's use of staged incidents to justify aggression became a template examined by Allied intelligence planners. If Germany could manufacture a casus belli, so could the Allies, but in reverse, using deception not to start a war but to misdirect one already underway. The logic of Gleiwitz used controlled information to shape perception would find its mirror in British and American deception operations. Fake armies, phantom invasions, turned agents feeding lies back to Berlin. The radio tower at Gleiwitz stood quiet after that night, its role in history brief and brutal. Franciszek Honiok's name was forgotten for decades, his death unmarked except in obscure case files and war crimes transcripts. But the principle embedded in his murder, that truth could be staged, recorded, and broadcast as fact, became part of the invisible toolkit of World War II intelligence. The camera pulled back from the tower, its steel frames stark against the September sky. Across the border, real Polish soldiers were waking to the sound of German artillery. The invasion had begun, not because of what happened at Gleiwitz, but because the lie had done its work. It had created a story that required no belief to function, only repetition. Chapter 3. Set Europe ablaze. The fall of France in June 1940 left Britain isolated, its army evacuated from Dunkirk, its coastline exposed to invasion. Conventional military strategy offered limited options. The chiefs of staff could defend the island, rebuild the forces, and hope for American intervention. But Winston Churchill, newly appointed Prime Minister, wanted more than survival. He wanted resistance, sabotage, and subversion across occupied Europe. He wanted to set Europe ablaze. On July 22, 1940, the British government formally established the Special Operations Executive (SOE), an organization tasked with coordinating espionage, sabotage, and guerrilla warfare in territories under Axis control. Its charter was audacious: recruit, train, and deploy agents into hostile countries, supply partisan movements with weapons, explosives, and radio equipment, disrupt enemy logistics, communications, and morale, and do so without the protections afforded to regular soldiers. SOE operatives, if captured, were not prisoners of war. They were spies, subject to interrogation, torture, and execution. SOE's headquarters sat at 64 Baker Street in London, an address that would become synonymous with clandestine operations. Its first director, Sir Frank Nelson, was a businessman and former diplomat, chosen for organizational skill rather than military experience. Churchill placed SOE under the Ministry of Economic Warfare, a bureaucratic home that reflected its mission: economic and psychological disruption, not battlefield victory. The challenges were immediate and immense. SOE needed to recruit people willing to parachute into occupied territory, live under false identities, and carry out missions with minimal support. It needed training facilities, secure communications, and methods for inserting agents across defended borders. And it needed to do all of this while navigating rivalries with MI6, the Secret Intelligence Service, focused on intelligence gathering rather than direct action, and skepticism from military commanders who saw sabotage as peripheral to the main effort. Recruitment began in secret. SOE sought individuals with language skills, technical expertise, and psychological resilience. Many early recruits came from expatriate communities: French, Polish, Czech, Norwegian people with personal stakes in liberating their homelands. Others were British civilians, engineers, teachers, artists, anyone whose background might provide cover in occupied territory. Women were recruited as radio operators, couriers, and saboteurs, a radical departure from conventional military practice. SOE eventually deployed at least 50 women into the field, many of whom were captured and executed. Training took place at requisitioned country estates scattered across Britain and Scotland. Arisaig House, in the Scottish Highlands, became a centre for paramilitary instruction, demolition, silent killing, fieldcraft, survival. Bolio, a manor in Hampshire, taught tradecraft, how to build a cover story, tail a suspect, resist interrogation, operate a dead drop. The curriculum was relentlessly practical. Trainees handled live explosives, practiced shooting with silenced pistols, learned to forge documents and defeat locks. The instructors included professional criminals, safecrackers recruited from British prisons to teach breaking and entering. SOE's technical section developed equipment tailored for covert operations. Explosives disguised as lumps of coal, designed to be shoveled into locomotive fireboxes, where they would detonate and destroy the engine. Time delay fuses hidden in metal tubes the size of pencils, silenced weapons, miniature cameras, hollow coins that concealed microfilm or suicide pills. Silk maps printed with escape routes, sewn into jacket linings. These devices were functional art, designed to pass inspection and remain hidden until the moment of use. Communication with agents in the field relied on radio. SOE issued suitcase-sized transceivers, later refined into smaller sets, powered by batteries or hand-cranked generators. Each radio operator, called a pianist in SOE slang, had an individual transmission style, a recognizable fist that helped London verify their identity. Security checks were embedded in messages, deliberate errors or code phrases that, if omitted, signaled the operator was transmitting under duress. These checks saved some agents and doomed others, depending on whether German intelligence, after capturing an operator, noticed the missing signals or convinced London they were authentic. The first SOE missions were small, tentative, and often ended in failure. Agents parachuted into France found themselves isolated, their reception committees compromised or non-existent. Radio sets failed. Cover stories collapsed under Gestapo interrogation. Early losses were catastrophic. Entire networks rolled up within weeks. But SOE learned, adapted, and persisted. The human cost was intimate and measured in absences. Violette Sabo, a Franco-British agent, parachuted into France in 1944 to coordinate resistance before D-Day. She was captured, interrogated at Gestapo headquarters, and sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp, where she was executed in early 1945. Noor Inayat Khan, an Indian-born British agent and descendant of Indian royalty, worked as a radio operator in Paris. Betrayed, arrested, and tortured at Gestapo headquarters on Avenue Foch, she refused to break. She was sent to Dachau and shot on September 13, 1944. These were not abstractions. They were people who walked into occupied territory knowing the risks, carrying forged papers and cyanide capsules, operating alone or in pairs, maintaining cover under conditions of constant surveillance. SOE's long-term impact was uneven but undeniable. In France, SOE supported resistance networks disrupted German rail traffic before and after D-Day, delaying the movement of reinforcements toward Normandy. In Norway, SOE commandos sabotaged heavy water production at the Vemork plant, crippling German nuclear research efforts. In the Balkans, SOE liaisons supported partisan forces that tied down entire Axis divisions. The cost in lives was significant. Over 13,000 SOE agents deployed, approximately 3,200 died. But the deeper consequence was conceptual. SOE proved that irregular warfare, sabotage, and subversion could function as strategic tools, not just nuisances. It demonstrated that civilians could be trained as operatives and that occupied populations, given weapons and coordination, could resist effectively. And it established a model recruiting, training, covert insertion, indigenous support that would be studied and replicated by intelligence services long after the war ended. Back in London, the staff at 64 Baker Street worked through the nights, coding messages, planning drops, reading casualty reports. The work was endless and mostly invisible. No medals were awarded for missions that officially never happened. No names appeared in newspapers. The secrecy surrounding SOE persisted for decades. Full records were not declassified until the early 2000s. But in the summer of 1940, as Britain stood alone and invasion seemed inevitable, Churchill's directive to set Europe ablaze became a functional reality. The fires were small, scattered, and often extinguished quickly, but they burned. And across occupied Europe, in silent rooms and dark forests, people were learning that resistance had a name, an address, and the will to supply them with the tools they needed to fight back. Chapter 4. Double Cross System. The knock came at dawn. Franz von Rintelen opened the door of his London boarding house to find two men in dark coats, polite but firm. They identified themselves as officers of MI5, Britain's security service. Von Rintelen was not surprised. He was a German intelligence officer sent to Britain in autumn 1940 as part of Germany's preparation for invasion Operation Celian. His mission was to gather intelligence on British defences, coastal installations, and military movements, then transmit reports back to Hamburg via wireless radio. He never sent a single authentic report. Within hours of landing, von Rintelen was in custody. MI5 had been waiting. British Signals Intelligence, operating under the codename Most Secret Sources, later revealed as decrypted Enigma traffic, provided advance warning of German agents being inserted into Britain. The messages did not always include names, but they gave dates, landing zones, and instructions. MI5 tracked the expected arrival points, beaches, airfields, remote countryside, and picked up the agents as they arrived. Von Rintelen faced a choice: execution as a spy or cooperation. He chose cooperation. He became the first in what would eventually grow into a network of more than 120 captured and turned German agents, all controlled by MI5 under a system known as the Double Cross System, operated by the 20 Committee, or XX Committee, the Roman numeral for 20, forming a double cross. The 20 Committee was chaired by John Masterman, an Oxford academic and former intelligence officer. Its members included representatives from MI5, MI6, military intelligence, and other agencies. The committee met weekly in a nondescript office in St. James's Street, reviewing case files, drafting deceptive messages, and coordinating the activities of double agents. The goal was not merely to neutralize German espionage in Britain, but to turn it into a weapon, feeding Germany false information that would shape its strategic decisions. The mechanics were simple in theory, brutal in execution. Each captured agent was assessed. Those deemed unreliable or dangerous were imprisoned or executed. Those deemed controllable were turned. MI5 officers worked with the agent to craft a believable persona, what the agent's handlers in Germany expected to see. The agent would continue transmitting, using their original wireless set or a duplicate built by British technicians. But the content of every message was written by MI5. The transmissions had to be perfect. German intelligence trained its radio operators to recognize each agent's fist, the unique rhythm and style of their Morse code transmission. Any deviation could trigger suspicion. MI5 employed the original agents to send the messages, maintaining their individual fists. If an agent refused or was unavailable, British radio operators practiced mimicking their style for weeks until the imitation was seamless. Security checks, deliberate errors embedded in messages to verify the sender was operating freely, posed another risk. The Germans used security checks inconsistently. Some agents had them, others did not. MI5 studied the patterns. If a check was required, the British included it. If an agent was captured in the fictional narrative being fed to Germany, MI5 would omit the check, signaling duress. Whether German intelligence noticed or cared was a question answered only through continued monitoring. One of the most valuable double agents was Arthur Owens, codenamed Snow, a Welsh businessman with pro-German sympathies. Owens had been recruited by German intelligence before the war. When war broke out, he offered his services to Britain, MI5 ran him as a double agent, using his wireless link to Hamburg to send a steady stream of fabricated reports. Snow's handlers in Germany believed he was operating a network of sub-agents across Britain, feeding intelligence on RAF bases, naval movements, and industrial production. In reality, every sub-agent was fictional, and every report was composed in an MI5 office. The intelligence Snow transmitted was carefully calibrated. It had to contain enough truth to maintain credibility, verifiable facts about British geography, infrastructure, or events already known to Germany through other sources. But the critical details were false or misleading. Troop locations were inflated or shifted. Production figures were exaggerated or minimized, depending on strategic goals. The art of deception lay in the mixture. 90% believable truth to sell the 10% critical lie. The 20 Committee also used double agents for defensive purposes, identifying German intelligence priorities. If Germany asked an agent to gather specific information, say, details on British radar installations or the location of a particular division, that question revealed German knowledge gaps and strategic concerns. MI5 could then tailor responses to exploit those gaps. As the war progressed, the double-cross system expanded. Agents arrived by parachute, submarine, and neutral ship. Some were ideological committed Nazis sent to spy for the Reich. Others were reluctant, coerced, or bribed into service. A few were opportunists looking for adventure or money. MI5 turned them all, building a portfolio of controlled assets whose reports collectively painted a false picture of Britain for German intelligence. One critical test came in 1941, as Germany shifted focus eastward toward the Soviet Union. MI5 used double agents to reinforce the deception that Britain remained vulnerable to invasion, encouraging Germany to maintain defensive forces in the West rather than transferring them to the Eastern Front. The fictional networks reported British troop buildups, coastal fortifications, and morale problems, anything that suggested Britain might attempt a landing in occupied Europe or that Germany still needed to guard against a British offensive. The cost of failure was absolute. If Germany discovered that its agents were controlled, the entire system would collapse. Worse, Germany might use the knowledge to feed Britain disinformation, reversing the flow. MI5 lived in constant fear of exposure, monitoring every transmission, interrogating every new capture, searching for signs that the deception had been penetrated. The evidence suggests it never was. German intelligence records captured after the war showed that the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, believed its British networks were functioning successfully. Reports from double agents were filed, analyzed, and passed to German military planners. The deception held. The consequence was strategic. The double-cross system did not win battles directly, but it shaped the environment in which battles were fought. It denied Germany reliable intelligence on Britain. It allowed Britain to control the narrative of its own strength and intentions, and it established a framework, capture, control, deceive, that would be applied on a larger scale in the deceptions around D-Day. Back in the MI5 offices, the work was quiet, methodical, and relentless. Each week, new messages were drafted, reviewed, and transmitted. Each week, new agents were captured, interrogated, and assessed. The war of codes and wireless signals proceeded in rooms lit by desk lamps, typed on carbon paper, filed in locked cabinets. Franz von Rintelen, the agent who opened his door to MI5 that autumn morning, spent the war in British custody, his wireless set silent, his mission repurposed. He never returned to Germany. When the war ended, he faded into the margins of history, one name among thousands in the archives of the Invisible War. The double cross was not a symbol, it was a system, and it worked. Chapter 5 Ultra's price tag. The huts at Bletchley Park were cold in winter stifling in summer, and filled with the constant mechanical clatter of the bomb's electromechanical machines designed to break German Enigma ciphers. Each bomb bay stood roughly 7 feet tall, weighed a ton, and contained 108 rotating drums wired to simulate Enigma rotors. When activated, the machine cycled through thousands of possible rotor settings per minute, searching for configurations consistent with intercepted messages. The sound was industrial, clicking, whirring, relentless. By mid-1941, Bletchley Park had become a factory of secrets. Shifts ran 24 hours. Wireless intercept stations across Britain fed raw German signals to Bletchley by motorcycle courier and teleprinter. Cryptanalysts worked in specialized huts. Hut 6 handled German Army and Air Force Enigma. Hut 8, led by Alan Turing, attacked German naval Enigma. Hut 3 translated and analyzed decrypted Army and Air Force messages. Hut 4 did the same for naval decrypts. By 1942, Bletchley employed over 9,000 people, mathematicians, linguists, clerks, engineers, wrens, Women's Royal Naval Service members operating the bombs. The intelligence derived from Enigma decrypts was codenamed Ultra. It was classified at the highest level, above top secret. Access was restricted to a handful of senior commanders and intelligence officers. Decrypts were never transmitted by wireless or telephone. They were hand-delivered by intelligence liaison officers in sealed envelopes. After reading, recipients returned the documents to the courier, who destroyed them. No copies were kept at field headquarters. The reason for such extreme security was existential. If Germany discovered that Enigma was compromised, it would change encryption systems overnight. Bletchley's advantage would evaporate. Months or years might pass before the new systems were broken. If they could be broken at all, the Allies would be blind. This created a strategic dilemma that haunted every ultra-based operation: how to use secret intelligence without revealing the source. The problem was operational and moral. Ultra sometimes provided precise information: convoy routes, U-boat positions, troop movements, supply schedules. Acting on that information too directly risked exposure. If a convoy changed course to avoid a U-boat wolf pack predicted by Enigma decrypts, and the U-boats found no targets where they expected to, German intelligence might suspect a leak. If the pattern repeated, they might investigate encryption security. To protect Ultra, British intelligence developed a doctrine: never act on Ultra intelligence alone. Every ULTRA-derived operation required a cover story, a plausible alternative explanation for how the intelligence was obtained. Before attacking a U-boat position revealed by Enigma, RAF Coastal Command would first send a reconnaissance aircraft over the area. The aircraft's sighting would be logged and reported through normal channels. Only then could the attack proceed, ostensibly based on aerial reconnaissance rather than code breaking. This doctrine had costs. Reconnaissance flights took time, and U-boats moved. Weather could prevent flights entirely, forcing commanders to let opportunities slip. Sometimes, ships were allowed to sail into danger because acting would require revealing Ultra. The calculus was brutal: sacrifice a convoy to preserve the source, if the source would save more convoys in the future. The ethical weight fell on individuals. In May 1941, Ultra revealed that a German supply ship, Gdania, carrying Enigma materials and codebooks, was operating in the North Atlantic. Capturing those materials could accelerate Bletchley's progress on German naval Enigma, which remained only partially broken. British naval forces located and sank Gdania, but survivors were rescued by another German vessel before the British could board. The operation succeeded tactically, but failed to capture the critical materials. Weeks later, Ultra identified another opportunity. The weather ship München, operating in the Arctic, carried Enigma settings and codebooks. On May 7, 1941, the British destroyer Somali intercepted München, boarded her before the crew could destroy the Enigma materials and seize the codebooks. The intelligence windfall allowed Bletchley to read German naval traffic for weeks. But the action was visible. A German ship attacked, crew captured, materials missing. German naval intelligence investigated but concluded the loss was due to British naval patrol patterns, not a cryptographic breach. Enigma remained in service. The tension escalated with operational scale. In November 1941, ultra-decrypts revealed the location and route of a large German supply convoy heading to North Africa, critical to Rommel's Afrika Korps. The Royal Navy dispatched Force K from Malta to intercept. On the night of November 8th of 9, Force K ambushed the convoy, sinking all 10 cargo ships. It was a catastrophic loss for Germany. Fuel, ammunition, and vehicles desperately needed in the desert went to the bottom of the Mediterranean. German intelligence analyzed the disaster. How had the British known? Suspicion initially fell on Italian naval codes, which were less secure than German systems. The Italians were blamed. Enigma remained trusted, but the incident illustrated the risk. Each perfect interception raised the chance of German suspicion. The moral calculus became explicit in rare cases. There are persistent accounts, debated among historians, that ultra-intelligence about German bombing raids on British cities was sometimes withheld to avoid exposing the source. The claim is that warnings were not issued or evacuations not ordered because acting on foreknowledge would reveal code breaking. The evidence is contested, and some historians argue that ultra-information on bombing targets was often too vague or too late to be actionable. But the theoretical dilemma was real. If saving lives today exposes the source that will save more lives tomorrow, what is the correct choice? Churchill knew. A small circle of ministers and military chiefs knew. The commanders in the field often did not. Intelligence summaries based on ultra were reworded to obscure their origin, attributed to a reliable source, or special intelligence. Field officers made decisions based on information whose provenance they could not question and whose certainty they could not verify. The consequence was a new kind of command burden. Generals and admirals held secrets their subordinates did not share. Victories were celebrated publicly, while their true causes remained classified. Men died in battles that might have been avoided if intelligence had been acted upon, but the intelligence had to be protected for battles yet to come. Bletchley Park's output grew relentlessly. By 1943, the park was decrypting thousands of German messages daily. The intelligence fed into Allied operations across every theater: convoy routing in the Atlantic, air targeting in the Mediterranean, deception planning for Sicily and Normandy, Eastern Front assessments relayed to Moscow. Ultra did not win the war alone, no single factor did, but it shortened the war, saved lives in aggregate, and gave Allied commanders an advantage that shaped strategic outcomes. Yet, it came with a price, paid in silence and in decisions made under the weight of knowledge that could not be shared. The bombs kept running, the decrypts kept flowing, and the operators in the huts kept their mouths shut. Bletchley's staff signed the Official Secrets Act, pledging silence for life. Many kept that pledge for decades, carrying wartime secrets into the 1970s. When Ultra was finally declassified, and the public learned what had been hidden in the English countryside behind barbed wire and misdirection, the price of Ultra was discipline. Every officer who read a decrypt knew that acting too perfectly would destroy the source. Every commander who ignored intelligence because using it was too dangerous carried the weight of ships lost and men drowned. The invisible war demanded invisible sacrifices, and history recorded only the outcomes, not the agonizing choices behind them. The huts at Bletchley stood empty after the war, then fell into disrepair, then were preserved as a museum. The bombs were dismantled, some destroyed, a few saved for posterity. The people scattered back to universities, government service, quiet retirements. Most never spoke of what they had done. The work had been classified, essential, and ultimately invisible. And that invisibility was part of its success. Chapter 6. Sorge in Tokyo. Richard Sorge was a German communist, a Soviet spy, and a journalist accredited to the German embassy in Tokyo. He was also one of the most successful intelligence operatives of World War II until he wasn't. Sorge arrived in Japan in 1933, carrying credentials as a correspondent for the Frankfurter Zeitung, a respected German newspaper. His cover was solid. He was German by birth, educated at German universities, a wounded veteran of World War I. He spoke fluent German, Russian, and passable Japanese. He cultivated contacts within the German embassy, the Japanese government, and the expatriate community. He drank heavily, socialized widely, and gathered information with a tradecraft so effective it took Japanese counterintelligence 8 years to identify him. But Sorge worked for Soviet military intelligence, the GRU. His mission was to penetrate German and Japanese decision-making circles and report strategic intentions back to Moscow. He built a network of agents, recruited from journalists, business contacts, and ideological sympathizers. The most valuable was Hotsumi Ozaki, a Japanese journalist with access to government policy discussions and ties to Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe's brain trust. Sorge's intelligence reached Moscow through radio transmissions and courier routes. His reports covered German-Japanese relations, Japan's strategic debates about expansion, and critical questions about Japan's intentions toward the Soviet Union. In 1941, those questions became existential. Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa. Soviet forces reeled under the assault, losing millions of men, thousands of tanks and aircraft, vast stretches of territory. Stalin faced a strategic nightmare: fight Germany in the west while guarding against a possible Japanese attack in the east. Soviet forces in Siberia and the Far East numbered over 1 million men, held in reserve to defend against Japan. If Japan attacked, the Soviet Union would face a two-front war it could not sustain. Sorge's mission was to answer one question: would Japan strike north against the Soviet Union or south against British and American holdings in Southeast Asia and the Pacific? Throughout summer 1941, Sorge gathered intelligence. Ozaki provided insights from Japanese policy circles. Japan's military and political leadership were divided. The army favored a northern strategy seize Soviet territory in Siberia and Mongolia while the Red Army was occupied in the west. The navy favored a southern strategy capture resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia, the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, and the Philippines, securing oil, rubber, and strategic position in the Pacific. By September, Sorge had his answer. Japan would strike south. The decision had been made at imperial conferences in early September 1941. Japan would prepare for war with the United States and Britain, not the Soviet Union. The northern border would remain quiet. Sorge transmitted the intelligence to Moscow. Stalin, initially skeptical, he distrusted intelligence that seemed too convenient, eventually accepted the report. Soviet divisions began transferring west from Siberia to the European front, arriving in time to reinforce the defense of Moscow in late 1941. The transfer was a calculated risk based partly on Sorge's intelligence, and it contributed to the Soviet ability to stop the German advance and launch a winter counteroffensive. But Sorge's network was unraveling. Japanese counterintelligence Tokyo, the special hire police, had been tracking suspicious radio transmissions from Tokyo for months. Direction-finding equipment narrowed the search. In August 1941, Tokyo arrested Yotoku Miyagi, one of Sorge's couriers, on unrelated charges. Under interrogation, Miyagi broke. He revealed names. Arrests followed, each prisoner leading to others. On October 18, 1941, Japanese police arrested Richard Sorge at his home in Tokyo. He was taken to Tokyo headquarters, interrogated, and held without trial. Ozaki was arrested the same day. The network was destroyed. Sorge's interrogation lasted months. He eventually confessed, providing detailed accounts of his espionage activities, his methods, his contacts, and his ideological motivations. Japanese authorities compiled a massive case file, documenting one of the most successful spy operations against Japan in the war. But the Japanese government faced a dilemma: what to do with Sorge. He was a German national, spying for the Soviet Union, while Japan and the Soviet Union maintained a neutrality pact. Revealing the case publicly would embarrass both Germany and Japan. Germany, an Axis ally, had unwittingly harbored a Soviet spy in its embassy. Japan had failed to detect him for 8 years. The decision was bureaucratic silence. Sorge and Ozaki were tried in secret, convicted of espionage, and sentenced to death. The German embassy was quietly informed but took no action to secure Sorge's release. Nazi ideology classified communists as enemies. Sorge's German citizenship offered no protection. Sorge and Ozaki remained in prison for 3 years. On November 7, 1944, they were executed by hanging at Sugamo Prison in Tokyo. Sorge was 59 years old. The Japanese government did not publicly announce the executions. The Soviet Union did not acknowledge Sorge as an agent. Stalin refused to confirm or deny the connection, treating him as expendable. It was not until 1964, nearly 20 years after his execution, that the Soviet Union officially recognized Sorge as a hero of the Soviet Union, awarding him the title posthumously. Moscow's streets and monuments were named in his honor. His story was sanitized, romanticized, and turned into propaganda. The reality, a man who drank too much, took reckless risks, and died in a prison cell, was submerged beneath the myth of the perfect spy. But the lesson for intelligence history was clear. Even the most valuable networks have a shelf life. Operational security decays over time. Couriers break under interrogation. Direction-finding technology improves. And once a network is compromised, it collapses quickly, leaving only the intelligence it managed to transmit before the door closed. Sorge's reports from Tokyo traveled thousands of miles, across radio waves and courier routes, into the hands of Soviet planners who used them to make decisions that shaped the war. Then the network went dark, the agents were arrested, and the channel closed. The intelligence had done its work. The price was paid in silence, in a prison in Tokyo, while the war raged on. Chapter 7: America's Warning Problem. The machine sat in a locked room in Washington, D.C., operated by a team of U.S. Navy cryptanalysts working in shifts. It was called Purple, the American codename for the Japanese diplomatic cipher system. By 1940, U.S. cryptanalysts had broken Purple through a combination of mathematical analysis and reverse engineering, building replica machines that could decrypt Japanese foreign ministry traffic. The intelligence derived from Purple was codenamed Magic, and it gave the United States access to Japan's diplomatic communications messages between Tokyo and Japanese embassies around the world, including Washington, Berlin, and London. Magic revealed Japan's strategic intentions, its negotiations with the United States, and its assessments of American resolve. But Magic had limits. It covered diplomatic traffic, not military communications. Japan's Army and Navy used separate cipher systems, which U.S. cryptanalysts had not fully broken by late 1941. Magic could reveal what Japan's diplomats were saying, but not always what Japan's military was planning. In the months leading up to December 1941, Magic intercepts painted a picture of deteriorating U.S.-Japan relations. Japan's expansion into Southeast Asia, its occupation of French Indochina, and its alignment with Germany and Italy under the Tripartite Pact had brought it into direct conflict with American interests. The United States imposed economic sanctions, freezing Japanese assets and embargoing oil exports. Japan, dependent on imported oil, faced a choice: back down or secure resources by force. Magic intercepts showed Japan preparing for war. On November 19, 1941, Tokyo instructed its embassy in Washington to destroy code machines and classified documents, a clear indicator that diplomatic relations were ending. On November 26, Japan's final negotiating position was rejected by the United States. On December 1, an intercepted message from Tokyo to its Berlin embassy stated that war with the United States and Britain was imminent. U.S. intelligence officers in Washington knew war was coming, but knowing war is coming is different from knowing where and when. Magic did not reveal Japan's target: Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, all were possible. Japan's carrier fleet, the core of its striking power, had gone silent. Japanese naval radio traffic dropped sharply in late November, a sign that major operations were underway, but direction finding and traffic analysis could not locate the carriers. Warnings were issued. On November 27, the U.S. War Department sent a message to commanders in Hawaii, the Philippines, and other Pacific outposts. Hostile action possible at any moment. The message advised them to take defensive measures but did not specify a threat. The warning reached Admiral Husband Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, and Lieutenant General Walter Short, Commander of U.S. Army Forces in Hawaii. Both interpreted the warning as a general alert, not an imminent attack. Short ordered sabotage precautions aircraft were parked wingtip to wingtip to prevent sabotage, making them perfect targets for air attack. No one expected Japan to strike Hawaii. The strategic consensus in Washington was that Japan would strike south toward Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, possibly the Philippines. Hawaii, over 4,000 miles from Japan, seemed too distant and too risky. Intelligence assessments discounted the possibility of a carrier raid on Pearl Harbor. On December 6, 1941, U.S. cryptanalysts decrypted a Japanese message known as the 14-part message, a lengthy diplomatic note instructing Japan's ambassador to break off negotiations with the United States. The message did not specify military action, but its tone was final. A follow-up message instructed the ambassador to deliver the note at precisely 1:00 p.m. Washington time on December 7. The timing was significant. 1:00 p.m. in Washington was early morning in Hawaii. Intelligence officers in Washington recognized the implication. The deadline might coincide with a military operation. Warnings were drafted and sent, but delays in decryption, translation, and transmission meant they arrived too late. At 7:48 a.m. Hawaii time, December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. The attack lasted less than 2 hours. 8 U.S. battleships were damaged or destroyed. Over 2,400 Americans were killed, and the Pacific Fleet was crippled. The United States entered World War II. The failure to prevent Pearl Harbor became one of the most scrutinized intelligence failures in history. Magic had provided strategic warning. Japan was preparing for war, but not tactical warning when and where the attack would come. The information was there, but fragmented, ambiguous, and mixed with noise. Analysts in Washington had access to decrypts, but not always to context. Commanders in the field received warnings, but lacked specifics. The problem was structural. U.S. intelligence in 1941 was decentralized. The Army and Navy ran separate cryptanalytic operations that sometimes competed rather than collaborated. There was no unified intelligence assessment center, no systematic method for correlating signals intelligence with other sources. Information flowed upward and outward, but slowly and without synthesis. After Pearl Harbor, the US government began restructuring intelligence. The Office of Naval Intelligence and Army Intelligence expanded. New procedures for handling and distributing magic intelligence were implemented. Access was broadened to include more commanders and agencies, but with strict compartmentalization to protect sources. The lesson was painful. Intelligence without integration is noise. Collecting secrets is one thing, making sense of them is another. The United States had broken Japan's diplomatic codes, intercepted its communications, and read its intentions. But the system for turning that information into actionable warning failed. The consequence was institutional. The intelligence failures of Pearl Harbor contributed to the creation of more centralized structures. Eventually, after the war, the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. But in 1941, the cost was immediate. Lives lost, ships sunk, a fleet crippled, and a nation thrust unprepared into global war. In Washington, the purple machines kept running, the decrypts kept flowing. The war had begun, and magic intelligence would continue to shape operations throughout the Pacific, convoy routing, battle planning, diplomatic maneuvering. But the question lingered: if intelligence could not prevent Pearl Harbor, what good was it? The answer was complex. Intelligence is not a crystal ball. It provides fragments, probabilities, patterns. It reduces uncertainty, but does not eliminate it. And sometimes, the warning is there, buried in the data, waiting for someone to notice before it is too late. Chapter 8. OSES, a new toolset. The organization was born from necessity and impatience. By early 1942, the United States was at war on two fronts, but it lacked a centralized intelligence service capable of espionage, sabotage, and covert operations. The FBI handled domestic counterintelligence. Military intelligence focused on tactical battlefield information, but no agency coordinated strategic intelligence, ran agents behind enemy lines, or conducted the kind of irregular warfare that Britain's SOE had been practicing since 1940. On June 13, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed a military order establishing the Office of Strategic Services, OSS. He appointed William J. Donovan, a World War I hero, lawyer, and Republican political figure, as its director. Donovan had spent 1940 and 1941 studying British intelligence methods, visiting London, meeting with SOE and MI6 officials, and advocating for an American equivalent. Now he had the authority to build it. The OSIS Charter was expansive: collect and analyze strategic information, conduct espionage, support resistance movements, carry out sabotage and psychological warfare, and coordinate intelligence sharing with allied services. It was part spy agency, part commando force, part research bureau. Donovan envisioned an organization that combined scholarship and action, academics who could parachute into enemy territory, soldiers who could analyze intelligence, diplomats who could plant explosives. Recruitment reflected that vision. OSS drew from Ivy League universities, law firms, corporations, and the military. It sought linguists, area specialists, engineers, and people with unusual skills, safecrackers, forgers, chemists. The roster included future CIA directors, federal judges, historians, and diplomats. It also included adventurers, eccentrics, and people motivated by ideology or adrenaline. Training began at facilities across the United States. The OSS established a network of schools and camps modeled on British SOE practices. Area B, near Baltimore, Maryland, taught basic espionage, tradecraft, surveillance, codes, disguises, cover stories. Area F, known as the Farm in rural Virginia, focused on demolitions, weapons, and fieldcraft. Area A, Congressional Country Club in Maryland, handled psychological assessment, weeding out recruits unsuitable for clandestine work. The curriculum was ruthlessly practical. Recruits learned to kill silently, pick locks, forge documents, and operate wireless radios. They practiced parachute jumps, learned to navigate by starlight, and memorized cover identities until they could recite them under stress. Training instructors included British SOE veterans, who taught American recruits the same methods they had used in occupied Europe. OSS Technical Services developed specialized equipment. The Research and Development Branch, led by scientist Stanley Lovell, produced devices that blended engineering with espionage. Time, delay fuses disguised as cigars or fountain pens, explosives molded to resemble lumps of coal or pancakes of flour, designed to be mixed into enemy supplies undetected, silenced pistols, compact radios, escape maps printed on silk, compasses hidden in uniform buttons. One innovation was the ELP pill, a cyanide capsule encased in rubber, designed to be carried in the mouth. If captured, an agent could bite down, breaking the capsule, and die within seconds. The pill was voluntary, not every operative carried one, but its existence reflected the stakes. OSS agents operating in enemy territory faced interrogation, torture, and execution if caught. The ELP pill was a final option, a guarantee that some information would never be extracted. OSS operations began cautiously. Early missions were small, inserting agents into North Africa to gather intelligence before the Allied invasion in November 1940. 2. Coordinating with French resistance, supporting British operations in Europe. As the war expanded, so did OS activities. In Europe, OSS worked closely with SOE, parachuting agents into France, Italy, and the Balkans to organize resistance, sabotage railways, and gather intelligence. Jedburgh teams, 3-man units consisting of an American, a British, and a French operative, dropped into occupied France before and after D-Day, arming and coordinating resistance groups. The Jedburghs operated behind enemy lines, disrupting German communications and supply routes, tying down troops that might otherwise have reinforced the Normandy defenses. In Asia, OSS operated in Burma, China, and Indochina. Detachment 101, an OSS unit in Burma, trained and led caching guerrillas against Japanese forces, conducting reconnaissance and sabotage deep in Japanese-held territory. The unit eventually grew to over 10,000 indigenous fighters, supported by a small cadre of American OS officers. Detachment 101 accounted for thousands of Japanese casualties and rescued over 200 downed Allied airmen. OSS also ran intelligence operations targeting neutral countries. Agents in Switzerland, Turkey, and Sweden gathered information on German industry, military movements, and political developments. In Bern, Switzerland, Alan Dulles, future CIA director, operated an OSS station that cultivated sources inside Nazi Germany, including contacts within the German military and intelligence services. But OSS faced bureaucratic resistance. The FBI, led by J. Edgar Hoover, opposed OS operations in Latin America, viewing it as FBI territory. Military intelligence agencies resented OSS encroachment on their roles. The State Department distrusted OSS for conducting what amounted to private diplomacy. Donovan navigated these rivalries with political skill, leveraging Roosevelt's support and delivering results that justified OSS's existence. The human cost was measured in quiet losses. OSS agents disappeared into occupied territory, their fates unknown for months or years. Some were captured, interrogated, and executed. Others completed their missions and returned, carrying experiences they could not discuss. The work was classified, the operations deniable, and the recognition non-existent. By war's end, OSS had grown to over 13,000 personnel, operating in every theater. Its contributions were uneven but significant. OSS intelligence informed Allied strategic decisions. OSS sabotage disrupted Axis logistics. OS support for resistance movements tied down enemy forces and provided Allied commanders with local knowledge and irregular warfare capabilities. But OS's most enduring legacy was institutional. In September 1945, President Harry Truman disbanded the OSS, scattering its personnel and functions across various government agencies. But the need for centralized intelligence did not disappear. In 1947, the National Security Act established the Central Intelligence Agency, inheriting many of OS's functions, personnel, and methods. The CIA became the peacetime descendant of Donovan's wartime experiment. Back in Washington in 1942, the OSS was just beginning. Recruits trained in Maryland forests, technicians assembled explosive devices in labs, analysts pored over maps and reports. The organization was improvised, ambitious, and unproven, but it worked, and the model it established, combining intelligence collection, analysis, and covert action under one roof, shaped the structure of American intelligence for the rest of the century. Donovan's vision was simple: information is a weapon, and the United States needed an organization capable of wielding it. The OSS became their organization, and the war gave it the opportunity to prove the concept. The results were mixed, the costs real, and the lessons learned. Intelligence and action, combined, could influence outcomes, but the price was paid by individuals, agents in the field, operating alone, carrying pills and forged papers, hoping their luck and training would hold. Chapter 9. AIF is short on water. The basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters in Pearl Harbor was crowded, dimly lit, and filled with the clatter of typewriters and the hum of ventilation fans struggling against Hawaiian heat. It was here, in a space known as Station HYPO, that a team of US Navy cryptanalysts worked around the clock to break Japanese naval codes. The code was JN-25, Japan's main operational cipher for naval communications. It was a book code combined with an additive cipher. Messages were encoded using a codebook that assigned 5-digit numbers to words and phrases, then further encrypted by adding 5-digit keys from a separate additive book. The result was a double-layered encryption that changed periodically as Japan issued new codebooks and additives. By early 1942, US cryptanalysts had achieved partial breaks into JN-25. They could read fragments of messages, enough to identify call signs, locations, and sometimes operational intentions, but rarely enough to reconstruct complete orders. The process was painstaking. Intercepted messages were logged, code groups were cataloged, patterns were analyzed, and probable meanings were guessed based on context and traffic analysis. Station HYPO was led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, a cryptanalyst who had spent years studying Japanese language and codes. Rochefort worked in a basement office, often wearing a smoking jacket and slippers, surviving on coffee and little sleep. His team included linguists, mathematicians, and radiomen, specialists who listened to Japanese transmissions, logged frequencies, and tracked the movement of Japanese naval units based on signal strength and direction. In May 1942, HYPO began noticing an increase in Japanese radio traffic, much of it referencing a target designated by the letters AF. The Japanese were planning a major operation. The target was mentioned repeatedly, but its identity was unclear. Where was AF? US intelligence had several theories. Some analysts believed AF was the Aleutian Islands, the chain of islands stretching westward from Alaska. Others thought it might be Hawaii itself, or possibly the US West Coast. The uncertainty was dangerous. The US Pacific Fleet, still recovering from Pearl Harbor, could not afford to guess wrong. Deploying carriers to defend the wrong location would leave the real target exposed. Rochefort believed AF was Midway Atoll, a small island roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Midway was strategically significant, a US base that served as a refueling station for submarines and patrol aircraft. Capturing Midway would extend Japan's defensive perimeter and potentially draw out the remnants of the US Pacific Fleet for a decisive battle. But Rochefort needed proof. He devised a plan, a ruse to confirm AF's identity. In late May, Rochefort coordinated with the US garrison on Midway. The garrison sent a radio message in plain language, unencrypted, reporting that Midway's water distillation plant had broken down and the island was running short on fresh water. The message was broadcast on a frequency monitored by Japanese listening stations. Then Rochefort waited. Within days, HYPO intercepted a Japanese naval message, encrypted in JN-25, reporting that AF is short on water. The confirmation was immediate and conclusive. AF was Midway. Japan was planning an attack on the atoll, likely with carrier forces. Rochefort passed the intelligence to Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the US Pacific Fleet. Nimitz believed Rochefort. He ordered the Pacific Fleet's available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktowns, hastily repaired after damage at the Battle of the Coral Sea, to position northeast of Midway, where they could ambush the Japanese fleet. Japan's plan was complex. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, intended to lure the US carriers into a trap. A diversionary strike on the Aleutian Islands would draw American attention north. Then the main Japanese force, including 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryo, would strike Midway, destroy its defenses, and occupy the island. When the US carriers arrived to counterattack, Japanese battleships and cruisers would annihilate them. But Yamamoto's plan assumed the Americans did not know the attack was coming. That assumption was wrong. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Japanese carrier aircraft launched the first strike against Midway. US aircraft based on the island counterattacked, but suffered heavy losses against superior Japanese fighters. The Japanese carriers prepared a second strike to finish off Midway's defenses. Then US carrier scouts reported the Japanese fleet's location. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Enterprise and Hornet, ordered an immediate strike. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding Yorktown, did the same. American dive bombers and torpedo bombers launched, racing toward the Japanese carriers. The torpedo squadrons attacked first. Flying slow, obsolete TBD devastators at low altitude, they were slaughtered by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet lost all 15 aircraft. Only one crew member survived. The sacrifice was not in vain. The Japanese fighters swarmed low to intercept the torpedo bombers, leaving the high-altitude dive bombers unprotected. At 10:22 a.m., SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown rolled into their attack dives. The Japanese carriers were vulnerable. Flight decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed, fuel hoses running, bombs and torpedoes stacked on deck. The American bombs struck home. Akagi was hit and set ablaze. Kaga was hit multiple times and engulfed in fire. Sori took 3 bombs and began to burn. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were mortally wounded. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, counterattacked, damaging Yorktown. But later that afternoon, American dive bombers found Hiryu and destroyed it as well. By the end of the day, all 4 Japanese carriers were sinking or abandoned. Japan lost over 300 aircraft and thousands of experienced aircrew, pilots, bombardiers, mechanics. The US lost Yorktown's finished off by a Japanese submarine 2 days later and 1 destroyer, along with about 150 aircraft. The Battle of Midway was a strategic turning point. Japan's carrier force, the offensive striking power that had dominated the Pacific since Pearl Harbor, was crippled. Japan would never recover the numerical or qualitative edge it had held in early 1942. The initiative in the Pacific shifted to the United States, and it began with a single sentence, transmitted in the clear: "Midway is short on water." Rochefort's ruse worked because it exploited a gap in Japanese operational security. The Japanese believed their codes were secure, so they trusted the intercepted plane language message and included it in their encrypted traffic. They did not suspect that the plane language message was bait, designed to confirm intelligence the Americans had already gathered through code breaking. The consequence was measured in steel and lives. 4 Japanese carriers sunk, hundreds of aircraft destroyed, thousands of trained aircrew lost. The Pacific balance of power shifted in a single day. Based on intelligence derived from intercepted radio signals, partially broken codes, and a clever deception to confirm a target designation, Rochefort and his team at HYPO received little public recognition. The intelligence was classified, the methods secret. Rochefort himself was later reassigned, sidelined by bureaucratic rivals who resented his success and his unorthodox methods. He was not promoted to flag rank during the war, and his contributions were not fully acknowledged until decades later. But in early June 1942, in the waters northeast of Midway, American dive bombers screamed down through broken clouds toward Japanese carriers burning on a blue sea. The pilots did not know about Station HYPO or JN-25, or the ruse about water shortages. They knew only their targets, their training, and the narrow window of opportunity in front of them. They did their job. Rochefort had done his. And the war in the Pacific turned on that intersection of intelligence, deception, and execution. Each element essential, none sufficient alone. Chapter 10. Operation Vengeance. The message was intercepted on April 13, 1943 by U.S. Navy listening stations monitoring Japanese naval radio traffic in the South Pacific. It was encrypted in JN-25, the same code that had been partially broken before Midway. Cryptanalysts at Fleet Radio Unit Pacific's FYPAX in Pearl Harbor decrypted the message within hours. The content was extraordinary, a detailed itinerary for Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, traveling from Rabaul to inspect forward bases in the Solomon Islands. The message listed departure times, flight paths, aircraft types, and arrival schedules. Yamamoto would fly in a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber escorted by 6 A6M0 fighters, departing Rabaul at 6 o'clock a.m. on April 18, and arriving at Balliol Airfield near Bougainville at 8 a.m. The intelligence was passed up the chain of command. It reached Admiral Chester Nimitz in Hawaii, who forwarded it to Admiral William Halsey, commander of South Pacific Forces, with a simple question: could Yamamoto be intercepted? The decision to target Yamamoto was strategic and controversial. Yamamoto was Japan's most respected naval commander, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, and a symbol of Japanese military power. Killing him would be a propaganda victory and might disrupt Japanese naval operations. But the mission required acting on decrypted intelligence in a way that might expose ULTRA-level code-breaking. If Japan suspected its codes were compromised, it might change encryption systems, blinding American intelligence. The risk was weighed and accepted. The target was too valuable. The mission was code, named Operation Vengeance. The operational challenge was distance. Yamamoto's flight path would take him over Bougainville, deep in Japanese-held territory, over 400 miles from the nearest American airbase at Guadalcanal. No American fighter in the theater had the range to reach Bougainville, intercept Yamamoto, and return, except one, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, a twin-engine, twin-boom fighter with external fuel tanks that extended its range to over 1,000 miles. 18 P-38s from the 330th Fighter Squadron, led by Major John Mitchell, were selected for the mission. The plan was simple but demanding: fly low over the ocean to avoid Japanese radar, navigate over 400 miles of open water with minimal landmarks, intercept Yamamoto's flight at precisely 8 a.m., shoot down his aircraft, and return before running out of fuel. On the morning of April 18, 1943, the P-38s took off from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. They flew in radio silence, skimming the ocean at 50 feet, navigating by dead reckoning and compass. The flight took over 2 hours. At 7:58 a.m., the P-38s climbed to altitude and spotted 2 Betty bombers and 6 Zero escorts, exactly on schedule, descending toward Balliol. The Americans split into 2 groups. 4 P-38s, led by Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber, attacked the bombers. The remaining 14 engaged the Zero escorts, preventing them from interfering. The action lasted less than 2 minutes. Lanphier and Barber dove on the bombers. 1 Betty was hit and crashed into the jungle. The second ditched in the ocean. Japanese Zero swarmed the attackers, but the P-38s disengaged and fled at full speed, their fuel running low. Japanese search parties later found the wreckage of the first bomber in the jungle. Inside was Admiral Yamamoto, still strapped into his seat, dead from gunshot wounds. He had been killed instantly when the aircraft was hit. The death of Yamamoto was announced by Japan on April 21. After a period of official silence, the Japanese government attributed his death to enemy action during an inspection tour, but did not provide details. In Japan, Yamamoto's death was a shock. He was given a state funeral, honored as a national hero, and mourned publicly. In the United States, the mission's success was celebrated quietly, publicly. The military claimed the interception was a chance encounter. American fighters on patrol happened to spot Japanese aircraft and attacked. The true story: that Yamamoto's itinerary had been decrypted and the mission planned days in advance, remained classified for decades. The intelligence community debated whether Operation Vengeance had been worth the risk. The mission was a perfect interception, too perfect. If Japanese intelligence analyzed the attack carefully, they might suspect their codes were compromised. But post-war examination of Japanese records showed that Japan attributed the interception to bad luck or a security leak in Rabaul, not to code breaking. JN-25 remained in service, and US cryptanalysts continued reading Japanese naval traffic. The strategic impact of Yamamoto's death is debated among historians. Japan's naval operations did not collapse. Yamamoto's successors were competent, and Japan continued fighting for 2 more years. But Yamamoto's loss had psychological weight. He was irreplaceable as a strategist and a leader, and his death deprived Japan of its most experienced naval commander at a critical point in the war. The ethical question was also debated, though less publicly. Targeting a specific individual based on intelligence was unprecedented in modern warfare. Some viewed it as legitimate. Yamamoto was a military commander, a lawful target. Others saw it as assassination, a step beyond conventional combat. The distinction mattered little to the pilots who flew the mission. They had orders, a target, and a narrow window of fuel and time. Captain Lanfear and Lieutenant Barber both claimed credit for shooting down Yamamoto's aircraft, a dispute that was never fully resolved and became a source of lifelong contention between the two men. The official record credited both, but the controversy highlighted the fog and chaos of combat. Even in a mission planned with precision, the final moments were chaotic, and certainty was elusive. Operation Vengeance demonstrated a principle: signals intelligence, when combined with operational capability, can produce precise, targeted outcomes. But the precision comes with costs: the risk of exposing sources, the ethical weight of deliberate targeting, and the psychological impact of using secret knowledge to kill a named individual. The P-30As returned to Guadalcanal, their fuel tanks nearly empty, the pilots exhausted and exhilarated. They had completed one of the longest fighter intercept missions of the war, navigating hundreds of miles over open ocean, arriving at the exact moment and place, and accomplishing the mission. It was a triumph of intelligence, planning, and execution. But it was also a reminder that intelligence is a weapon with a recoil. Every use risks exposure, every success raises the stakes, and the people targeted are not abstractions on a map, they are individuals with names, faces, and funerals. Yamamoto's death changed nothing immediately, but it added to the cumulative weight of losses. Japan was beginning to suffer across the Pacific. The jungle on Bougainville swallowed the wreckage. The war moved on. And in Pearl Harbor, the cryptanalysts at FRU Paris continued their work, reading intercepts, logging traffic, and passing intelligence to commanders who would use it in ways both ordinary and extraordinary. Chapter 11, El Alameин's Fake Army, the Western Desert of Egypt in late 1942 was a landscape of sand, rock, and heat, empty except for the armies that had been fighting across it for 2 years. The British 8th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery, faced the German-Italian Panzer Army Africa, commanded by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. The front line ran through a coastal town called El Alamein, the last defensible position before the Nile Delta and the Suez Canal. Montgomery was planning an offensive. He had numerical superiority, over 190, 5,000 men, 1,000 tanks, and 900 artillery pieces, against Rommel's 116,000 men, 500 tanks, and 500 guns. But numbers alone would not guarantee victory. Rommel was a master of armored warfare, experienced in desert fighting, and capable of counterattacking with speed and precision. Montgomery needed not just strength but surprise. He needed Rommel to be looking in the wrong direction when the attack came. Enter deception. The British deception plan for El Alamein, code named Operation Bertram, aimed to convince Rommel that the main British attack would come in the south, while the real assault would strike in the north. To sell the deception, the British built a fake army in the south and hid the real army in the north. The construction was elaborate. In the southern sector, British engineers erected dummy tanks, wooden frames covered with canvas, painted to resemble real armor from the air. Over 600 dummy tanks were positioned in assembly areas, suggesting a buildup of armored forces. Dummy supply dumps were created using empty crates, fuel cans, and canvas sheets arranged to simulate stockpiles of ammunition and fuel. At night, trucks moved through the dummy positions, raising dust and creating the impression of activity. The British also built a fake water pipeline, a visible line of stacked pipes stretching southward, supposedly carrying water to support a buildup in the southern sector. The construction was deliberately slow, progressing at a rate that suggested the attack would not come until November. German aerial reconnaissance photographed the pipeline, tracked its progress, and estimated completion dates, all part of the deception plan. Meanwhile, in the northern sector where the real attack would occur, British forces moved into position under cover. Tanks were disguised as trucks by covering them with wooden frames and canvas sheets that mimicked the shape of supply vehicles. Real supply dumps were camouflaged or hidden. Artillery pieces were dug in and concealed with netting and sand. At night, units moved forward. By day, they remained still, avoiding detection. German reconnaissance aircraft flew over the British positions daily, photographing the dummy army in the south and seeing only trucks and supply dumps in the north. Rommel, analyzing the intelligence, concluded that the British were preparing for an offensive in the south, not before November. He positioned his mobile reserves accordingly. The deception worked. On the night of October 23, 1942, Montgomery launched Operation Lightfoot, the opening phase of the Second Battle of El Alamein. Over 800 British artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously, bombarding German and Italian positions in the northern sector. Infantry advanced through minefields under cover of darkness, clearing lanes for the armor. The attack caught Rommel's forces by surprise, not in timing, but in location. The main German reserves were in the wrong position, too far south to intervene immediately. The battle lasted 12 days. It was grinding, attritional, and costly. British infantry and engineers cleared minefields under fire. Tanks dueled at close range in clouds of dust and smoke. Rommel counterattacked repeatedly, but his forces were outnumbered and outgunned. German fuel shortages, exacerbated by Allied interdiction of supply convoys across the Mediterranean, limited Rommel's ability to maneuver. By November 4, Rommel's line had collapsed. German and Italian forces began retreating westward, abandoning equipment and positions. The British pursued, but logistical constraints and Rommel's skillful rearguard actions prevented a complete encirclement. Nonetheless, the victory was decisive. The Axis had lost over 30,000 casualties and 500 tanks. The British had broken the deadlock in North Africa and begun the long drive westward toward Tunisia. Operation Bertram was one contributing factor in the British victory, not the sole cause. Montgomery's numerical superiority, artillery firepower, and meticulous planning were equally important. But the deception bought time and space. Rommel's reserves were out of position at the critical moment, and that delay cost the Axis momentum and casualties. The lesson was doctrinal deception, when integrated into operational planning, can multiply the effectiveness of force. The dummy tanks and fake pipelines did not fire a shot, but they shaped Rommel's decisions, influenced his deployments, and contributed to British success. The techniques used at El Alamein, dummies, camouflage, fake construction projects, controlled movement patterns, became standard practice in later operations. The British refined these methods and applied them on an even larger scale in the deceptions around D-Day. The desert became a laboratory for deception, and the lessons learned in sand and heat transferred to the fields of France. After the battle, the dummy tanks were dismantled or left to decay in the desert. The fake pipeline was abandoned. The real army moved west, chasing Rommel across Libya. And in London, the deception planners studied the results, wrote reports, and began preparing for the next operation. El Alamein was not won by deception alone, but deception helped. And in a war where every advantage mattered, where casualties were counted in thousands and victories measured in miles, a well-placed dummy tank or a fake pipeline could save lives by misdirecting the enemy's attention at the moment when it mattered most. The desert wind erased the tracks, filled in the foxholes, and buried the evidence. But the principle remained: make the enemy see what you want them to see, and they will go where you want them to go. It was a lesson as old as warfare itself, updated with canvas and wood, and applied with precision in the sand. Chapter 12. Black May. The North Atlantic in early 1943 was a battlefield without trenches, fought in darkness, fog, and towering swells. German U-boats hunted Allied convoys carrying supplies, troops, and equipment from North America to Britain. The convoys were Britain's lifeline. Without them, the island could not sustain its war effort, feed its population, or build up forces for an eventual invasion of Europe. For 3 years, the U-boats had held the advantage. Operating in coordinated groups called wolf packs, U-boats would locate a convoy, shadow it, call in reinforcements by radio, and attack at night from the surface, where their speed and low profile made them difficult to detect. Allied losses were staggering. Millions of tons of shipping sunk, thousands of merchant sailors drowned. But by spring 1943, the balance was shifting. The shift was technological, tactical, and intelligence-driven. British and American forces deployed new tools: long-range patrol aircraft equipped with radar and depth charges, escort carriers that provided air cover in mid-ocean, improved sonar, and HF-DFs or high-frequency direction finding, pronounced HF-DUF, radio direction finding equipment that allowed escort ships to locate U-boats by triangulating their radio transmissions. The intelligence advantage came from ULTRA. By early 1943, Bletchley Park was reading German naval enigma with increasing speed and accuracy, U-boat operational orders, position reports, and Wolfpack coordination messages were intercepted, decrypted, and passed to the Admiralty's submarine tracking room in London. There, analysts plotted U-boat positions on large wall maps and routed convoys around known concentrations of submarines. But the U-boats adapted. In early 1943, Germany introduced a fourth rotor to naval enigma machines, temporarily blinding Bletchley Park's codebreakers. For weeks, Allied convoy routing was blind, and losses spiked. In March 1943 alone, U-boats sank over 100 Allied ships, totaling more than 600,000 tons, a rate of loss that, if sustained, would cripple the Atlantic supply line. Then Bletchley broke the new four-rotor system. UAGA returned. Convoy routing became effective again, and the technologies that had been accumulating over 2 years, radar HFDF escort carriers, long-range patrol aircraft, converged with intelligence to create a decisive shift. May 1943 became known as Black May for the U-boat force. In that single month, the Royal Navy, Royal Canadian Navy, and U.S. Navy sank 41 U-boats, more than in any previous month of the war. The losses were catastrophic. U-boat crews, previously confident in their ability to sink merchant ships faster than they could be replaced, now found themselves hunted, detected, and destroyed at rates that made operations untenable. The mechanics of defeat were cumulative. HFDF allowed escort ships to detect U-boat radio transmissions and close on the source. Radar allowed aircraft to detect surfaced U-boats at night, catching them before they could dive. Escort carriers provided air cover over convoys, forcing U-boats to remain submerged, where they were slow and nearly blind. ILTRA allowed convoys to be rerouted away from Wolfpack concentrations, reducing encounters. One engagement illustrated the shift. Convoy OMS-5 in late April and early May 1943. OMS-5 was a slow westbound convoy of 43 merchant ships, escorted by British and Canadian warships. German intelligence located the convoy, and over 30 U-boats were directed to intercept. The resulting battle lasted several days. The U-boats sank 13 merchant ships, a significant loss, but the escorts and aircraft sank 6 U-boats and damaged several others. The exchange rate, previously favorable to Germany, had reversed. On May 24, 1943, Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat force, made a strategic decision: temporarily withdraw U-boats from the North Atlantic. The losses were unsustainable. U-boat production could not replace the losses. Trained crews were dying faster than new crews could be trained. The Atlantic, the central theater of the convoy war, was no longer viable. The withdrawal marked a turning point. Germany never regained the initiative in the Atlantic. U-boats continued operations in other areas: Mediterranean, Caribbean, Indian Ocean. But the North Atlantic convoys, the critical link between America and Britain, became increasingly secure. Allied losses dropped sharply. By late 1943, more merchant ships were being built than sunk. The supply line held. The consequences were strategic. With the Atlantic convoys secure, the Allies could build up forces in Britain for the invasion of Europe. Supplies, equipment, and troops flowed across the ocean in increasing volume. The logistical foundation for D-Day was laid during the months following Black May, when the convoy system proved it could sustain the weight of global war. The cost in lives was measured on both sides. Allied merchant sailors died in torpedo attacks. Over 30,000 British merchant seamen alone. U-boat crews died at even higher rates. Of roughly 40,000 men who served in U-boats during the war, over 28,000 were killed, a casualty rate exceeding 70%. The underwater war was merciless, offering little chance of survival once a submarine was hit. Depth charges crushed hulls, men drowned in darkness, trapped in steel coffins, sinking into the abyss. The intelligence dimension remained hidden. ILTRA's role in the Battle of the Atlantic was not revealed until the 1970s. For decades, the public believed the victory was purely technological and tactical: radar, aircraft, and better training. The reality was more complex. Intelligence provided the foundation. Knowing where the U-boats were, where they were going, and how they planned to attack allowed convoys to avoid contact and escorts to concentrate forces. But intelligence alone was not enough. The tools to act on that intelligence, Aircraft, radar HFDF, trained crews, escort carriers were essential. The Battle of the Atlantic was won through the integration of intelligence technology and operational skill, each element reinforcing the others. In the North Atlantic, the swells rolled on indifferent. The convoys steamed eastward, their wakes white against dark water. The U-boats that once hunted freely now operated cautiously, aware that the ocean had eyes they could not see and ears that heard every transmission. The invisible war of signals and code-breaking had intersected with the visible war of steel and explosives, and the outcome was decided not in a single battle, but across months of cumulative attrition. Black May was not the end of the U-boat war, but it was the end of Germany's hope of severing the Atlantic lifeline. The convoys kept moving, the supplies kept flowing, and the invasion that would eventually liberate Europe became logistically possible because the sea lanes stayed open. Chapter 13. The Red Orchestra. The radio signal was faint, intermittent, and fleeting, but it was enough. German direction finding teams, equipped with mobile receivers mounted in unmarked vans, triangulated the source, an apartment building in Brussels, October 1941. The Gestapo moved in. Inside, they found a wireless transmitter, codebooks, and 3 Soviet intelligence officers: Leopold Trepper, a Polish Jew and director of Soviet intelligence operations in Western Europe, Anatoly Gorovich, a radio operator, and a network of agents, couriers, and informants. The network, later named Rote Kapelle, a red orchestra by German counterintelligence, had been operating across occupied Europe, gathering intelligence on German military deployments, production, and strategic planning, transmitting reports to Moscow via clandestine radios. The arrest in Brussels was the beginning of the unraveling. Trepper escaped the initial raid, but was captured in Paris in 1942. Under interrogation, he agreed to cooperate, or appeared to. The Gestapo, rather than simply dismantling the network, attempted to exploit it through a Funkspiel radio game, using captured radios and operators to send controlled messages to Moscow, attempting to deceive Soviet intelligence while identifying additional agents. The mechanics of the radio game were precise. The Gestapo forced captured radio operators to continue transmitting, but the content of the messages was written or approved by German intelligence. The goal was twofold: feed disinformation to Moscow and lure additional Soviet agents into contact, where they could be identified and arrested. But radio games required maintaining the illusion of authenticity. Soviet intelligence trained its operators to include security checks, deliberate errors or code phrases embedded in transmissions that signaled whether the operator was transmitting freely or under duress. If the checks were present, Moscow would accept the messages as genuine. If the checks were absent or incorrect, Moscow would know the operator had been compromised. The Gestapo studied the captured operators' transmission patterns, interrogated them about security protocols, and attempted to replicate the checks. In some cases, they succeeded. In others, they failed and Moscow recognized the compromise. The result was a deadly back and forth. Some agents were deceived and arrested. Others escaped or went silent. The human cost was intimate and brutal. Captured agents were interrogated at Gestapo headquarters, tortured for information, and often executed. The interrogations sought names, addresses, contacts, codes, and operational plans. Some agents broke quickly. Others endured weeks or months of interrogation before revealing information. A few revealed nothing, taking secrets to their deaths. One of the network's key members was Harro Schulz-Boysen, a German Luftwaffe officer and anti-Nazi who passed military intelligence to the Soviets. Schulz-Boysen was arrested in August 1942, along with his wife Libertas, after the Gestapo decrypted intercepted Soviet messages referencing his code name. Both were tried for treason and executed in December 1942, Harro by hanging, Libertas by guillotine. Over 50 members of the network in Germany were arrested and executed. In France and Belgium, additional arrests followed. The Gestapo rolled up cells in Paris, Lyon, Marseille, and Brussels, capturing radio operators, couriers, safe house operators, and informants. The network, which had numbered over 100 active agents at its peak, was systematically dismantled over the course of 1942 and 1943, but the consequences were double-edged. While Germany succeeded in destroying a significant Soviet intelligence network in Western Europe, The effort revealed vulnerabilities in German security. The Red Orchestra had operated for years inside occupied Europe, recruiting sources, transmitting intelligence, and evading detection. The fact that Soviet agents could penetrate German military and industrial circles demonstrated that Germany's internal security was not impregnable. The radio game itself had mixed results. Some disinformation fed to Moscow through compromised channels was believed and acted upon. Other messages were recognized as false, and Moscow adjusted accordingly. The Funkspiel became a battle of wits. German interrogators trying to extract enough information to sustain the deception. Soviet intelligence officers in Moscow trying to determine which transmissions were genuine and which were controlled. Trepper, the network's leader, played a complex role. After his capture, he appeared to cooperate with the Gestapo, providing information and participating in the radio game. But he also fed limited and carefully controlled information, protecting some agents while sacrificing others, and eventually escaped from German custody in 1943, hiding in Paris until the city's liberation in 1944. Post-war, Soviet intelligence did not fully trust him, suspecting he had cooperated too readily with the Germans. Trepper spent years in Soviet prisons before being released and eventually settling in Poland, where he lived quietly until his death in 1982. The story of the Red Orchestra illustrated a recurring theme in the invisible war: networks are fragile. A single arrest, a single captured radio, a single broken agent can unravel months or years of careful construction. Operational security decays over time. The longer a network operates, the greater the chance of detection. And once detection begins, the collapse can be swift and total. The lesson for intelligence organizations was clear: compartmentalization, discipline, and constant vigilance were essential. Agents needed to operate in isolated cells, with minimal knowledge of the broader network. Security checks needed to be robust and rigorously enforced, and the psychological resilience of operatives needed to be assessed carefully. Because under interrogation, even the strongest could break. The Gestapo's success in dismantling the Red Orchestra was operational, not strategic. The intelligence the network had provided to Moscow before its collapse had already shaped Soviet decisions. The warning signs of German preparations for Operation Barbarossa, though not fully believed by Stalin, had been transmitted. Later intelligence on German industrial production and military deployments had informed Soviet planning, but the human cost was total. Dozens executed, families destroyed. The survivors, those who escaped arrest or survived imprisonment, carried the weight of their experiences for the rest of their lives. Many were never publicly acknowledged, their contributions classified or dismissed in the complex politics of post-war Europe and the Cold War. The radios went silent. The safe houses were raided and emptied. The couriers stopped moving. The network dissolved into arrests, trials, and executions. And in the archives of the Gestapo and Soviet intelligence, the files accumulated: interrogation transcripts, decrypted messages, surveillance logs, documenting the rise and fall of one of the war's most significant espionage networks. The Red Orchestra's story was not one of triumph, but of endurance, sacrifice, and the brutal calculus of clandestine warfare. The network operated in the shadows, transmitting intelligence that shaped events it would never witness, and paid the price in lives that would remain largely forgotten until historians, decades later, sifted through the archives and reconstructed what had been lost. Chapter 14. A body off Spain. A body washed ashore near the Spanish fishing town of Huelva on the morning of April 30, 1943. A local fisherman spotted it floating face down in the surf, waterlogged and swollen, dressed in the uniform of a British Royal Marines officer. Attached to the wrist by a chain was a black briefcase. The Spanish authorities recovered the body, notified the British vice consul, and prepared for a routine wartime burial. But the body was not routine. It was Operation Mincemeat, one of the most audacious deception operations of World War II. The corpse was that of Glyndwr Michael, a homeless Welsh man who had died in London from ingesting rat poison in January 1943. His body had been stored in a morgue, then secretly transported to Scotland, where British intelligence officers prepared it for its final mission. Michael was given a new identity: Major William Martin, Royal Marines, attached to Combined Operations Headquarters. He was dressed in uniform, equipped with identity documents, personal letters, theater ticket stubs, a photograph of a fictitious fiancée, and, most importantly, a briefcase containing documents suggesting that the Allied invasion of southern Europe would strike Sardinia and Greece, not Sicily. The operation was planned by the 20 Committee, the same M5 group that ran Britain's double-agent network. The concept originated with Lieutenant Commander Ewan Montagu of Naval Intelligence and Flight Lieutenant Charles Cholmondeley of MI5. Their goal was to deceive German intelligence about the true target of the next Allied invasion in the Mediterranean. By spring 1943, the Allies were preparing to invade Sicily. Operation Husky, the first major landing on Axis, held European territory. Sicily was the logical target. It controlled the central Mediterranean, threatened Italian supply lines, and provided a stepping stone to the Italian mainland. German intelligence knew an invasion was coming. The question was where. Mincemeat aimed to convince Germany that the invasion would strike elsewhere. The documents in Major Martin's briefcase included a personal letter from Lieutenant General Archibald Nye, Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, to General Harold Alexander, commander of Allied forces in North Africa. The letter discussed plans for landings in Sardinia and Greece, with Sicily mentioned only as a cover for deception. The letter was carefully written to sound authentic, informal, detailed, and containing enough operational specifics to appear genuine. The body, with its briefcase chained to the wrist, was placed inside a sealed canister filled with dry ice and loaded aboard the British submarine HMS Seraph. On April 30, Seraph surfaced off the coast of Huelva, a location chosen for specific reasons. Huelva was in neutral Spain, but Spanish authorities were known to cooperate with German intelligence. The local German agent, a Spanish naval officer who reported to the Abwehr, had access to documents recovered from bodies washed ashore. At 4:30 a.m., the crew of Seraph opened the canister, dressed the body in a life jacket, and released it into the water, allowing the tide to carry it towards shore. The submarine submerged and departed. The Spanish authorities recovered the body hours later. They notified the British vice consul, but not before allowing the briefcase to be opened. The documents inside were photographed by Spanish intelligence and passed to the German Abwehr station in Madrid. The German agent forwarded the documents to Berlin, where they reached Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, and eventually Hitler himself. The Germans analyzed the documents. Were they genuine or a plant? The evidence pointed both ways. The body appeared authentic, decomposition consistent with days in the water, uniform and identity papers convincing. The documents looked genuine, proper letterhead, realistic language, operational details that fit Allied capabilities. But the scenario was almost too convenient. A courier carrying critical invasion plans, washed ashore exactly where German intelligence could access them. German intelligence debated the authenticity. Some officers were skeptical. Others believed the documents were real. Hitler, presented with the intelligence, accepted it as genuine. On May 12, 1943, he issued orders reinforcing German defenses in Sardinia and Greece. Troops were diverted from Sicily. Defensive preparations intensified in the wrong locations. Meanwhile, British intelligence monitored German reactions through ULTRA intercepts. Decrypted German messages showed that the deception was working. Reinforcements were moving to Sardinia. Minefields were being laid off Greece. German commanders were discussing the expected landings in locations far from Sicily. On July 10, 1943, the Allies invaded Sicily. The landings encountered resistance, but not the full weight of German forces that might have been present. German reserves were out of position, deployed based on the false intelligence from Operation Mincemeat. The invasion succeeded, and Sicily fell to the Allies by mid-August, opening the door to the Italian mainland. Operation Mincemeat did not win the Sicily campaign alone. Allied superiority in naval and air power, combined with effective amphibious planning and execution, were critical. But the deception shaped German deployments at a crucial moment, diluting their defensive strength and contributing to the success of the landings. The body of Major William Martin was buried in Huelva with full military honors. The Spanish authorities, believing him a British officer killed in a plane crash at sea, provided a grave and a headstone. The tombstone read, William Martin, born 29th March 1907, died 24th April 1940, 3. Beloved son of John Glyndwr Martin and the late Antonia Martin of Cardiff, Wales. Dulcet decorum est pro patria mores. It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. The true identity of the man in the grave remained secret for decades. The deception had worked because it exploited German expectations and desires. Germany wanted to believe that the invasion would strike Sardinia or Greece. Both were strategically valuable, and defending Sicily required concentrating forces in a narrow area, making them vulnerable to air and naval attack. The false documents confirmed what German planners hoped was true, and that hope made the lie believable. The ethical dimension was uncomfortable, but not widely debated at the time. The body used in mincemeat was a corpse. Glyndwr Michael had died of his own actions, and his body was used posthumously without his consent. His family was not informed. The identity given to him, Major William Martin, was entirely fictional. The operation treated a human body as a prop, a tool of deception, an object to be manipulated for strategic gain. But the war's moral calculus was weighted toward results. If using a corpse to deceive the enemy could save lives in an invasion, the operation was justified. The question of consent, dignity, and the treatment of the dead was subordinated to the imperatives of operational success. After the war, the truth about Operation Mincemeat gradually emerged. Ewan Montagu published a book, The Man Who Never Was, in 1953, describing the operation in detail, but still concealing Glyndwr Michael's true identity, which was not revealed until the 1990s. The operation became famous, celebrated as an example of British ingenuity and deception tradecraft. But in Hilva, the grave remained, a stone marker in a quiet cemetery, bearing a false name and a Latin inscription covering the body of a man who died in obscurity and was used, posthumously, to alter the course of a war. The tide that carried him ashore completed a mission he never knew he was on, and the lie buried with him helped thousands of soldiers land on a beach he never saw. Chapter 15. Cicero's camera. Ankara, the capital of neutral Turkey, was a city of spies. German, British, Soviet, and American intelligence services all operated there, cultivating sources, monitoring each other, and competing for influence. Turkey's neutrality made it valuable territory. Information flowed through the capital that would never cross belligerent borders, and diplomats spoke more freely than they would in London or Berlin. In October 1943, the German embassy in Ankara received a visitor. He was Eliezer Basner, an Albanian-born man in his late 30s, employed as a valet to the British ambassador, Sir Hugh Knatchbull Hugeson. Basner approached the Germans with an offer. He would sell them photographs of classified British documents. His price was high, £20,000 initially, then regular payments for continued access. German intelligence was skeptical. Walk-in sources offering secret documents were often traps, provocations, deception operations, or attempts to identify German intelligence officers. But Basner provided a sample, a photograph of a genuine British diplomatic cable. The Germans tested the information, confirmed it through other sources, and concluded the material was authentic. Basner was given the code name Cicero, after the Roman orator, reflecting the eloquence and value of the intelligence he provided. Basner's method was straightforward. As valet to the British ambassador, he had access to the ambassador's residence, including the study where classified documents were stored. The ambassador kept documents in a dispatch box in a safe. Basner had obtained keys, either copied or stolen, and access to both. Late at night, when the ambassador was asleep or out, Basner would open the safe, remove documents, photograph them using a Minox camera, small, high-quality espionage camera, and return the documents before morning. The photographed documents included diplomatic cables, minutes of Allied conferences, assessments of Turkish neutrality, and strategic discussions about Allied operations in the Mediterranean and preparations for the invasion of Europe. Basner passed the film to his German contact, Ludwig Moisich, an attaché at the German embassy. Moisich paid in cash, British pounds, stacks of currency that Basner hid and planned to use after the war. Over the course of 6 months, Basner delivered hundreds of documents. The intelligence was extraordinary. German analysts in Berlin read British assessments of German strength, Allied plans for the Balkans, discussions about Turkey's potential entry into the war, and details about forthcoming Allied operations. But there was a problem: the Germans did not fully trust Cicero. The material was too good. The source's access seemed implausible, and some of the intelligence contradicted information from other sources. German intelligence debated whether Cicero was genuine or a British plant, a deception operation designed to feed Germany false information or identify German intelligence networks in Ankara. Walter Schellenberg, head of SS Foreign Intelligence, was skeptical. He ordered his analysts to verify Cicero's documents against ULTRA intercepts and other intelligence. Some documents checked out, others could not be verified. The uncertainty paralyzed decision-making. Instead of acting on Cicero's intelligence, the Germans filed it, analyzed it, and debated its authenticity. Meanwhile, British intelligence began noticing anomalies. MI6 and MI5, monitoring German intelligence activities, picked up hints from decrypted German communications that suggested a leak at a high level. The references were vague, no names, no locations, but the pattern was concerning. ULTRA intercepts showed that Germany had access to information that should have been restricted to senior British officials. Suspicion fell on various possibilities: a compromised cipher, an agent inside the British government, a hidden microphone. MI6 sent security officers to Ankara to investigate. They reviewed embassy security, questioned staff, and examined communication procedures. But they did not initially suspect Basner. He was a valet, a low-ranking servant, not a diplomat or intelligence officer. The assumption was that any leak would come from someone with official access to classified material, not a household employee. Basner continued operating until April 1944. His exposure came not through British counterintelligence, but through a coincidence. A German secretary who had defected to the Allies provided information about Cicero to British intelligence. The details were fragmented, but enough to focus suspicion. The British ambassador's household was reviewed more carefully. Basner, realizing the investigation was closing in, resigned his position in April 1944 and fled Ankara. He escaped prosecution, but not consequence. The money he had been paid by the Germans, thousands of British pounds, turned out to be largely counterfeit. The Germans had paid him with currency printed as part of Operation Bernhard, a Nazi scheme to destabilize the British economy by flooding it with forged banknotes. Basner, after the war, discovered that his fortune was worthless. He spent years attempting to claim compensation from the German government, arguing that he had been defrauded, but his claims were dismissed. The intelligence Cicero provided to Germany had little strategic impact. Despite the extraordinary access and the volume of material, German decision-makers did not act decisively on the information. Some documents reinforced existing German assessments. Others were dismissed as deception. The result was intelligence paralysis, valuable information rendered useless by suspicion and bureaucracy. But Cicero exposed a critical vulnerability: physical security at diplomatic facilities. Classified documents, no matter how carefully encrypted in transmission, were vulnerable if stored insecurely. A trusted servant with access to a safe and a camera could compromise years of diplomatic correspondence in a matter of weeks. The lesson shaped post-war security protocols. Background checks, compartmentalization, and physical security became as important as cryptographic security. For British intelligence, the Cicero case was an embarrassment. The ambassador, Sir Hugh Knatchbull Hugeson, was not prosecuted or formally blamed, but his reputation was damaged. The breach occurred on his watch, in his residence, involving his personal staff. He completed his tenure in Ankara, but did not receive further high-level postings. Basner lived until 1970, dying in Munich at the age of 66. He wrote a memoir, I Was Cicero, which was adapted into a film, Five Fingers 1952. The memoir was self-serving, portraying Basner as a clever operative who outsmarted both the British and Germans. The reality was more prosaic. He was a valet motivated by money, who exploited lax security, sold secrets to an enemy that did not trust him, and was paid in counterfeit currency. The story of Cicero became a case study in espionage tradecraft, illustrating both the possibilities and limits of human intelligence. Access alone is not enough. The intelligence must be trusted, integrated, and acted upon. Cicero had access. He provided material. But the intelligence failed to produce strategic results because the recipients did not believe it. In Ankara, the British embassy tightened security. Safes were upgraded. background checks became more rigorous, and the quiet lessons spread through Allied intelligence circles. The invisible war was not fought only in cipher bureaus and interrogation rooms. It was fought in households, by servants with keys, cameras, and motives that no vetting process could fully predict. Chapter 16. The Ghost Army arrives. The convoy that arrived in England in early 1944 carried unusual cargo: inflatable tanks made of rubber, sound trucks equipped with speakers and tape recorders, and a unit of soldiers trained not to fight, but to deceive. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, informally known as the Ghost Army, was a U.S. Army unit of approximately 1,100 men tasked with tactical deception. Their mission was to impersonate other units, creating the illusion of divisions, armored battalions, and artillery concentrations that did not exist. The goal was to confuse German intelligence, misdirect enemy forces, and protect real American units by making the Germans think they were somewhere they were not. The Ghost Army's personnel were unconventional. The unit recruited artists, designers, sound engineers, and actors, people skilled in visual and auditory illusion. They were trained in camouflage, dummy construction, radio procedure, and the tactics of the units they would impersonate. Their equipment included inflatable tanks and artillery pieces that could be set up in hours, painted vehicles that mimicked real armor from aerial reconnaissance, and sonic trucks that played recordings of tank engines, troop movements, and construction sounds. The inflatable tanks were engineered with care. Made from rubberized canvas, they weighed less than 100 pounds and could be inflated by a few soldiers using air compressors in minutes. Once inflated and positioned, they resembled M4 Sherman tanks from the air and at a distance. The Ghost Army would deploy dozens of these dummies in assembly areas, park them in realistic formations, and add details, tire tracks created by dragging logs, fake antenna, camouflage netting, to sell the illusion. Sonic deception was more complex. The Ghost Army's 3,130 Twan Signal Service Company, special-operated sound trucks equipped with powerful speakers and playback equipment. Engineers had recorded actual sounds of armored units. Tank engines starting, tracks clanking, orders shouted, construction noise, and compiled them into soundscapes that could be played at high volume to simulate unit activity. The trucks would position near the front lines, hidden in forests or behind terrain, and broadcast these sounds toward German positions, creating the auditory impression of armor or infantry concentrations preparing for action. Radio deception completed the illusion. The signal company special transmitted fake radio traffic, mimicking the communication patterns of real divisions. Operators sent messages using the call signs, radio procedures, and encryption patterns of actual units, creating the electronic signature of a formation that existed only on German intelligence maps. The Ghost Army's first operations took place in France after D-Day. In June and July 1944, as Allied forces broke out of Normandy, the Ghost Army deployed near the front lines to support operational deceptions. One early mission, Operation Elephant, impersonated the U.S. 2nd Armored Division, creating the illusion that the division was in one location while the real unit moved to attack elsewhere. The deception involved inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, and visual displays of unit insignia and markings. The effectiveness was difficult to measure immediately. Deception's success is often invisible. The enemy does not attack because they believe forces are elsewhere. They do not reinforce because they think the main attack is in a different sector. Post-war analysis of German records suggested that some Ghost Army operations successfully missiled German intelligence, contributing to operational surprise and reduced resistance. But the work was dangerous. The Ghost Army operated near the front lines, often within German artillery range. Setting up inflatable tanks or sonic equipment under fire required speed and nerve. The troops were lightly armed. Their role was deception, not combat, but they faced the same risks as frontline units. Several Ghost Army soldiers were killed or wounded during operations. One of the unit's larger operations was Operation Viersen in March 1945, during the crossing of the Rhine River. The Ghost Army impersonated 2 full divisions, creating the illusion of a major buildup south of the actual crossing site. Inflatable tanks, dummy artillery, sonic broadcasts, and radio traffic suggested that the main Allied assault would come at a different location. German forces shifted resources to defend against the phantom threat, reducing resistance at the real crossing point where the US Ninth Army attacked. The Ghost Army operated throughout the European campaign, conducting over 20 deception operations in France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. The unit's activities remained classified long after the war. Many Ghost Army veterans did not speak about their service for decades, bound by secrecy oaths and the classified nature of deception operations. The unit was disbanded in 1945, and its records were sealed. It was not until the 1990s, when documents were declassified, that the full story of the Ghost Army became public. Historians and veterans began assembling the record, documenting the operation's techniques and contributions. The Ghost Army story became a symbol of creative, unconventional warfare, proof that deception, imagination, and technical skill could influence battles as much as firepower. The inflatable tanks deflated and were packed away. The sonic trucks were mothballed. The radio operators returned to civilian life, carrying memories of transmitting false messages into the dark, knowing that somewhere on the other side of the line, German intelligence officers were plotting phantom divisions on maps and shifting real troops to defend against threats that did not exist. The Ghost Army proved that war is not only about destroying the enemy's forces, but also about shaping their perceptions. Make them see what you want them to see, and they will deploy where you want them to deploy. It was theater applied to the battlefield, performed by soldiers who wore makeup instead of medals, and whose victories were measured in the attacks that never came. Chapter 17. Fortitude's Paper Army. The operation was so large that it required its own army, an army that did not exist. Operation Fortitude was the Allied deception plan for D-Day, designed to convince Germany that the invasion of France would land at the pass de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, rather than Normandy. The deception was essential. Normandy was chosen precisely because it was less expected, less heavily defended, and offered better opportunities for surprise. But if Germany discovered the true target in advance, it could concentrate forces and turn the invasion into a bloodbath. Fortitude was divided into two parts: Fortitude North, which suggested an invasion of Norway, and Fortitude South, which suggested the main landing would come at Pass de Calais. The focus was Fortitude South, the phantom army gathering in southeast England, poised to strike across the narrowest part of the Channel. The centerpiece of Fortitude South was Fusagi, the first US Army group, a formation that existed only on paper, in radio transmissions, and in German intelligence assessments. Fusagi was supposedly commanded by General George S. Patton, whom the Germans respected and feared as one of America's most aggressive commanders. The choice of Patton was deliberate. If he was in southeast England, Germany would believe the main invasion was being prepared there. Fusagi's divisions were scattered across Kent, Sussex, and East Anglia, locations visible to German aerial reconnaissance. The Allies constructed dummy installations, inflatable landing craft moored in rivers and harbors, fake fuel storage depots made from canvas and scaffolding, dummy aircraft parked on airfields, and tent cities suggesting troop concentrations. The landing craft were particularly important. Aerial reconnaissance could count vessels, and Germany knew an invasion required hundreds of landing craft. The Allies built dummy landing craft from wood and canvas, moored them in clusters along the southeast coast, and added details: fake anti-aircraft guns, camouflage netting, supply crates on docks, to create the appearance of invasion preparation. Radio deception was equally critical. Allied signals units transmitted a massive volume of fake radio traffic, simulating the communications of Fusagi's divisions, corps, and army headquarters. The traffic followed realistic patterns: command messages, logistical coordination, unit reports. German direction finding stations intercepted the signals, plotted their locations, and concluded that a large American force was gathering in southeast England. Double agents reinforced the deception. The 20 committees controlled German agents, particularly Garbo, the turned Spanish double agent, sent reports to Germany describing Fusagi's preparations. Garbo's messages were detailed and convincing. He described unit insignia he had supposedly seen, troop movements he had observed, and supply buildups in Kent and Sussex. His reports were believed by German intelligence, who considered Garbo one of their most reliable sources in Britain. The deception also included physical movement of real units. Some divisions that would eventually participate in the Normandy invasion were initially stationed in southeast England, where they were visible to German reconnaissance. Then, weeks before D-Day, they moved quietly to southern England, the actual embarkation areas for Normandy, while dummy units replaced them in the southeast. The timeline was crucial. The deception had to work not just before D-Day, but after. Even after the landings in Normandy began on June 6, 1944, the Allies needed Germany to believe that Normandy was a feint and the real invasion. The larger, more dangerous invasion was still coming at Pas de Calais. If Germany believed this, it would hold reserves in the Pas de Calais area instead of rushing them to Normandy. And it worked. German intelligence, relying on aerial reconnaissance, radio intercepts, and agent reports, concluded that Fusagi was real, and that Patton would command the main invasion at Pas de Calais. Adolf Hitler and the German High Command believed the assessment. Even after D-Day, when Allied forces were fighting in Normandy, Hitler refused to release the 15th Army, stationed in Pas de Calais, to reinforce Normandy. He believed the Normandy landings were a diversion designed to draw German forces away from Pas de Calais, where the main blow would fall. For 7 critical weeks after D-Day, the German 15th Army remained in Pas de Calais, guarding against an invasion that was never coming. Those 7 weeks allowed the Allies to build up forces in Normandy, establish a secure beachhead, and eventually break out into France. By the time Hitler realized Normandy was the main invasion and released the 15th Army to move south, it was too late. The Allies had won the lodgment. The cost of fortitude success was measured in German decisions not made, divisions not sent to Normandy, counterattacks not launched, reinforcements held back. The Phantom Army of Fusagi shaped German strategy more effectively than many real battles. But maintaining the deception required discipline and risk. Every action taken in southeast England had to support the fiction. Every radio transmission had to fit the pattern. Every agent report had to align with the larger narrative. One inconsistency, one broken piece of the illusion, and the entire deception could collapse. After the war, captured German intelligence records confirmed the extent of the deception's success. Maps found in German headquarters showed Fusagi divisions plotted in southeast England, complete with strength estimates, commander names, and operational assessments. German intelligence believed they knew where Patton was, where his forces were assembling, and where the invasion would strike. They were wrong on every count. Patton was in England, but not commanding an invasion force. He would eventually take command of the 3rd U.S. Army in Normandy, but only after the beachhead was secure. Fusagi never existed. The divisions plotted on German maps were phantoms, inflatable, transmitted, and imagined. Operation Fortitude was the largest and most complex deception operation of World War II. It integrated every tool available: dummy installations, radio deception, double agents, aerial misdirection, and real troop movements carefully choreographed to support the lie. And it succeeded because the lie was believable, consistent, and sustained long enough to matter. On the cliffs overlooking the channel, the inflatable landing craft sat in the water, motionless and empty. Above them, German reconnaissance aircraft flew, photographed, and reported back. The reports confirmed what Berlin expected to see: invasion preparations, exactly where they believed the invasion would come. And on the morning of June 6, 1944, when Allied forces stormed ashore in Normandy, far to the west, the German 15th Army waited in Pas de Calais, eyes fixed on a coastline where nothing would ever come. Chapter 18, Garbo. And the trust problem. His real name was Juan Pujol Garcia, a Spanish chicken farmer turned one of the most successful double agents of World War II. The Germans knew him as Irabel, an agent they trusted implicitly. The British knew him as Garbo, a code name reflecting his skill as a performer. Every message a scripted piece of theater, every report a carefully constructed fiction. By summer 1944, Garbo had been operating for over 2 years, feeding German intelligence a steady stream of reports from Britain. He claimed to run a network of sub-agents, over 24 fictional sources scattered across the United Kingdom, each with a cover identity, a plausible reason for access to information, and a distinct reporting style. There was Agent 3, a Venezuelan living in Glasgow with contacts in military circles. Agent 74, a sailor in the merchant navy who traveled widely and observed convoy movements. Agent 77, a soldier based in southeast England who reported troop buildups. None of them existed. Garbo's genius lay in detail. His messages to Germany were long, verbose, and filled with mundane observations mixed with critical intelligence, exactly what a real agent network would produce. He reported on British morale, food shortages, political debates, weather conditions, and military movements. Most of the information was true but useless, verifiable through other sources already known or irrelevant to German planning. But buried within the stream of reports were strategic deceptions, carefully timed and calibrated by MI5 to shape German decisions. The preparation for D-Day tested Garbo's credibility to its limits. In the months before the invasion, Garbo's fictional agents reported increasing military activity across southern England. They observed troop concentrations, new divisions arriving, landing craft being assembled, and supply dumps growing. The reports were consistent with what German aerial reconnaissance and radio intercepts suggested Britain was preparing for invasion. But Garbo's most critical mission came in the hours before D-Day and the weeks after. On the night of June 5-6, 1940, 4 hours before the Normandy landings began, Garbo sent an urgent message to his German handler in Madrid. The message warned that large-scale troop movements were underway and that an invasion appeared imminent. The message was delayed, intentionally, by MI5, so it arrived too late for Germany to act. But the timing was perfect. Garbo had warned of the invasion, proving his network's access and reliability, but the warning came too late to affect the outcome. The real test came after D-Day. On June 9, 1944, 3 days after the Normandy landings, Garbo sent a long, detailed message to Germany. The message, composed by MI5 and transmitted by Garbo, claimed that his network had pieced together the Allied deception plan. According to Garbo, the Normandy landings were a diversion, a secondary operation designed to draw German forces away from the real invasion, which would come at Pas-de-Calais, commanded by General Patton and the still assembling Fessy. The message was emphatic. The present operation, though a large-scale assault, is diversionary in character. The massive force in southeast England, observed by multiple sub-agents, remains in position. The enemy has not yet committed his main strength. Garbo urged German high command not to weaken defenses at Pas-de-Calais by transferring forces to Normandy. He warned that doing so would expose the 15th Army to the real invasion when it came. The message reached Berlin and was presented to Hitler. It confirmed what Hitler already suspected, that Normandy was a feint. Hitler ordered the 15th Army to remain in Pas-de-Calais. The divisions that might have reinforced Normandy and counterattacked the beachhead stayed where they were, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Garbo's deception held for weeks. His reports continued to describe Fessy's preparations, Patton's command activities, and the build-up in southeast England. German intelligence believed him. His credibility was so high that on July 29, 1944, Garbo received notification that he had been awarded the Iron Cross, second class, by Nazi Germany, in recognition of his intelligence work. It was an extraordinary honor, a German military decoration awarded to a British-controlled double agent, transmitted through enemy intelligence channels, celebrating reports that were entirely fabricated. The irony was lost on neither side. MI5 officers, reading the decrypted notification, recognized the absurdity. Germany was awarding one of its enemies a medal for lying to them. Garbo himself, sitting in London, writing fiction for German intelligence while British handlers reviewed every word, had achieved something almost unprecedented. Total trust from an enemy who should have been suspicious. But trust in espionage is fragile, and MI5 knew the deception could not last indefinitely. Eventually, Germany would realize Pas-de-Calais was not being invaded. Eventually, the absence of the expected attack would force a reassessment. The question was timing. How long could the deception hold? And what would happen when it collapsed? The deception held long enough. By late July, Allied forces had broken out of Normandy. The beachhead was secure, reinforcements were flowing in, and German forces were falling back. By the time Hitler finally released the 15th Army from Pas-de-Calais, the strategic moment had passed. The divisions moved south, but they could not reverse the Allied lodgment. After the breakout from Normandy, Garbo's role shifted. His messages became less frequent, his fictional network dispersed. As the Allied advance made their supposed positions untenable, MI5 gradually wound down Garbo's operations, moving him out of active deception work. By war's end, Garbo's network quietly dissolved, the fictional agents disappearing into the chaos of a continent in flux. Post-war, Garbo's contributions remained classified for decades. Juan Pujol Garcia, the man behind the code name, was debriefed, thanked, and released. He lived quietly, first in Venezuela and later in Spain, his wartime role unknown to the public. In the 1980s, his story was finally revealed, and he was invited to Britain, where he was awarded the Member of the Order of the British Empire, MBE, by the British government. Decades after the war, a second medal, this one from the side he had actually served. The significance of Garbo's work was measured not in battles fought but in battles avoided. His deception shaped German deployments, delayed reinforcements, and contributed to Allied success in the critical weeks after D-Day. He demonstrated that intelligence is not just about gathering information, it is about controlling the narrative, shaping perception, and exploiting trust. The Germans trusted Garbo because he told them what they wanted to believe, confirmed by details that seemed verifiable, delivered through a source who had never been caught in a lie. That trust was the weapon. And when trust is weaponized, truth and falsehood become indistinguishable inside the mind of the enemy. The messages stopped. The network went silent. The fictional agents faded into history. And in Madrid, a German intelligence officer filed the last report from WWII, never knowing that every word he had read, believed, and forwarded to Berlin was a lie written in a London office, typed by a Spanish chicken farmer who had become one of the war's most effective weapons. Chapter 19, Colossus and Tunny. The machine filled an entire room. 10 feet tall, 17 feet wide, weighing a ton, it was a forest of metal frames, vacuum tubes, and wiring. Over 1,500 thermionic valves glowing in the dim light, generating heat that required constant ventilation. It clicked and hummed, processing punched paper tape at 5,000 characters per second, searching for patterns invisible to human analysis. It was called Colossus, and it was the world's first programmable electronic digital computer. Colossus was built to break Tunny, the code name for the German Lorenz cipher, a teleprinter encryption system used by German High Command for strategic communications between Hitler, field marshals, and senior commanders. Tunny was more secure than Enigma. It employed 12 rotors instead of 3 or 4, and its encryption was applied directly to teleprinter traffic, producing messages that could be transmitted at high speed over landlines and radio links. The Lorenz machine, designated SZ40 and later C42, was never captured intact early in the war. British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park reverse engineered its operation from intercepted ciphertext, and a critical mistake made by a German operator in 1941. The operator had sent the same long message twice, using the same key settings but with slight variations in the plaintext. The two transmissions, intercepted by British listening stations, provided enough data for William Tutt, a mathematician at Bletchley, to deduce the Lorenz machine's logical structure without ever seeing one. But knowing the structure and breaking the cipher in operational time were different problems. Lorenz messages were long, complex, and computationally intensive to decrypt. Manual methods were too slow. Bletchley needed a machine that could process the data at electronic speeds. Tommy Flowers, an engineer at the Post Office Research Station, proposed building an electronic computer using vacuum tubes. The idea was radical. Vacuum tubes were considered unreliable, subject to failure, heat, and power consumption. Conventional electromechanical relays, though slower, were trusted, but Flowers argued that electronic switching would be fast enough to test the millions of possible rotor positions required to decrypt Tunny messages. He built the first Colossus in 10 months, working in secret with a small team at Dollis Hill in London. The machine was delivered to Bletchley Park in December 1943 and became operational in January 1944. It worked. Colossus processed punched paper tape containing the intercepted ciphertext. The tape looped through optical readers at high speed, while the machine tested patterns against known characteristics of the Lorenz cipher. When a probable match was found, the machine stopped and cryptanalysts examined the output. The process reduced decryption time from weeks to hours, sometimes faster. The intelligence derived from tunny decrypts was called Feisch, part of the broader UL-TIRA program. It provided insight into German strategic planning at the highest level. Hitler's directives to army groups, assessments of Allied intentions, defensive preparations, and internal debates within the German command structure. In the months before D-Day, Colossus and its successors, 10 Colossus machines were eventually built, with improved versions designated Mark II, decrypted German messages that revealed Hitler's belief in the past, Decoy's deception, his orders to hold reserves in place, and his strategic priorities. The intelligence confirmed that the Fortitude deception was working and that German forces were being held away from Normandy. But Colossus was fragile. The vacuum tubes failed regularly, requiring constant maintenance. Technicians worked in shifts, replacing burned-out tubes, adjusting circuits, and monitoring temperature. The paper tape, running at high speed, tore frequently, requiring splicing and rethreading. The machine demanded care, expertise, and patience. The operational consequence was immediate. Feisch intelligence complemented Enigma decrypts, providing a higher-level view of German strategy. Where Enigma revealed tactical and operational movements, Tunny revealed strategic intent. Together, they gave Allied commanders an unprecedented view of German decision-making. But the existence of Colossus and the breaking of Tunny remained one of the war's most closely guarded secrets. Even within Bletchley Park, access to Colossus was restricted. After the war, the British government ordered the machines destroyed. 8 were dismantled and their components scattered. 2 were moved to GCHQ, Britain's post-war signals intelligence agency, where they continued operating in secret until the late 1950s, working on Soviet ciphers during the early Cold War. The destruction of Colossus was strategic and tragic. It erased physical evidence of one of the most significant technological achievements of the war. Tommy Flowers, who had financed part of Colossus's development out of his own pocket, received no public recognition. The engineers and cryptanalysts who operated the machines were bound by secrecy oaths and could not speak about their work for decades. It was not until the 1970s, when UL-TIRA was declassified, that Colossus's existence became public. Even then, details remained sparse. Full technical documentation and photographs were not released until the 1990s. By that time, most of the people who built and operated Colossus had died, their contributions unrecognized. The legacy of Colossus extended beyond the war. It was a proof of concept. Electronic computation was not only possible but practical. The engineers who worked on Colossus carried their knowledge into post-war computing projects. The principles embedded in its design, programmability, electronic switching, high-speed data processing, shaped the development of modern computers. But during the war, Colossus was simply a tool. It hummed in a Bletchley hut, processing tape, breaking ciphers, and producing decrypts that traveled by courier to commanders who made decisions based on intelligence they could not question or verify. The machine worked in secret, maintained by people who could not speak of it, serving a purpose that would remain classified long after the war ended. In the dim light of the Colossus room, the valves glowed, the tape spun, and the machine processed the intercepted thoughts of an enemy command structure that did not know it was being read. The invisible war had become electronic, automated, and industrial, and the consequence was that secrecy could be broken at a speed that made even the most secure enemy communications vulnerable. If you had the machine, the knowledge, and the will to build it. Chapter 20, Operation Grafe. The snow began falling on December 16, 1944, covering the Ardennes forest in white silence. Beneath the trees, German forces assembled for a massive counteroffensive, Operation Wacht am Rhein, as Watch on the Rhine, later known as the Battle of the Bulge. The offensive aimed to split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the west. But embedded within the larger operation was a smaller, more sinister mission, Operation Grafe Griffin. Grafe was a deception and sabotage operation led by SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, a commando officer famous for rescuing Mussolini in 1943. Skorzeny's mission was to infiltrate Allied lines using soldiers dressed in captured American uniforms, driving captured or disguised American vehicles, speaking English, and sowing chaos behind enemy positions. The plan violated the laws of war. Combatants wearing enemy uniforms were considered spies or saboteurs, not legitimate soldiers, and were subject to summary execution if captured. Scorsese knew the risks. His men knew the risks. They volunteered anyway. Recruitment was difficult. Scorsese needed German soldiers fluent in English, willing to operate behind enemy lines in American uniforms, and capable of convincingly impersonating US troops. Few Germans met all three criteria. The unit eventually assembled roughly 150 men from various branches: Luftwaffe, Army, Waffen-SS, along with a handful of captured American vehicles, jeeps, trucks, and forged or stolen US military documents. The men were trained in American military procedures, slang, and behavior. They practiced using American weapons, learned to salute the American way, and memorized details about US culture: baseball teams, movie stars, cigarette brands. They were issued American uniforms, dog tags, and identification papers. Some disguises were convincing, others were improvised and fragile. The objectives of Operation Grafe were threefold: reconnaissance, gather intelligence on Allied positions and movements; sabotage, cut communication lines, misdirect traffic, and destroy fuel dumps; and psychological disruption, create confusion, panic, and mistrust among American forces. When the offensive began on December 16, Grafe teams infiltrated Allied lines. Some succeeded in passing checkpoints by speaking confident English and flashing forged orders. Others were stopped, questioned, and detected. The Americans, aware that German infiltrators might be operating, tightened security. Soldiers were stopped at checkpoints and asked questions that only Americans would know. Who won the World Series? What's the capital of Illinois? Who's married to Betty Grable? The questions were not foolproof. Some American soldiers failed them. Geography was not universal knowledge, and not everyone followed baseball. But the interrogations created paranoia. Rumors spread that German commandos were everywhere, disguised perfectly, indistinguishable from real Americans. Officers were stopped and questioned by their own men. General Omar Bradley, commander of the US 12th Army Group, was detained at a checkpoint and interrogated because he could not correctly answer a question about college football. The paranoia served Grafe's purpose. Even though only a few dozen infiltrators actually penetrated Allied lines, the psychological impact was far larger. Road signs were changed or removed. Traffic was rerouted. Checkpoints multiplied. Commanders issued orders not to trust anyone without verification. The disruption slowed American responses to the German offensive, contributing to initial German success. But Grafe's operational achievements were limited. Some teams successfully misdirected traffic, sending American units down wrong roads or delaying reinforcements. Others cut telephone lines or spread false reports of German breakthroughs. A few reached their objectives and gathered intelligence, but most were caught within days. Captured Grafe operatives faced immediate consequences. Under the laws of war, soldiers fighting in enemy uniforms were not entitled to prisoner of war protections. Several captured infiltrators were tried by military courts, convicted of espionage or violations of the laws of war, and executed by firing squad. The executions were controversial. Some argued that the men were soldiers following orders, others that wearing enemy uniforms forfeited their combatant status. Scorsese survived the operation and was captured by American forces in May 1945. He was tried at Nuremberg for war crimes related to Operation Grafe. His defense argued that wearing enemy uniforms for deception was legitimate as long as the soldiers removed the uniforms before engaging in combat. The prosecution argued that the operation violated the laws of war regardless of combat status. Scorsese was acquitted, partly due to testimony from Allied officers who acknowledged that similar tactics had been considered or used by Allied forces. The legacy of Operation Grafe was mixed. It demonstrated that deception was not an Allied monopoly. Germany, even in late 1944, was capable of innovative, unconventional operations. But it also revealed the limits of such tactics. Grafe created confusion and delay, but it did not achieve strategic objectives. The Battle of the Bulge eventually failed. Allied forces regrouped, reinforced, and counterattacked. By January 1945, German forces were in retreat, their offensive exhausted. But Grafe left a psychological scar. The paranoia it created, the fear that the enemy might be wearing your uniform, speaking your language, sitting next to you in a command post, persisted. Trust within military units became conditional, subject to verification through passwords, interrogation, and constant vigilance. The invisible war, which had been fought with ciphers and double agents, had crossed into the visible world, where soldiers could no longer trust their eyes. The snow continued falling in the Ardennes, covering wreckage, bodies, and the tracks of armies moving through frozen forests. The infiltrators, those who survived, were captured or escaped back to German lines. The forged documents were confiscated, the American uniforms were burned, and in the records of military justice, a handful of execution orders documented the price paid by men who crossed a line defined not by combat, but by costume. Chapter 21. The WWII Weapon Misinformation Campaign. The weapon arrived without warning. No engine roar, no air raid siren, just a supersonic shriek, a flash, and an explosion that collapsed buildings and killed dozens. The V-2 rocket, Germany's Virgiltungswaffe II Vengeance Weapon II, was the world's first long-range ballistic missile. Launched from mobile sites in occupied Europe, it arced into the stratosphere, reached speeds over 3,500 miles per hour, and struck London and other Allied cities with devastating randomness. The first V-2 hit London on September 8, 1944. Over the next 7 months, more than 1,400 V-2 struck Britain, killing over 2,700 civilians. There was no defense. The rockets flew too high and too fast for interception. Air raid shelters offered no protection. A direct hit obliterated everything within the blast radius. The psychological impact was profound, death arriving from the sky without warning, impossible to predict or prevent. But British intelligence had one advantage: the Germans did not know where their rockets were landing. V-2s were unguided after launch. They followed a ballistic trajectory determined by launch angle, fuel load, and engine cutoff. German engineers aimed the rockets at central London, using pre-set coordinates and calculations. But small variations in launch conditions, atmospheric winds, and mechanical inconsistencies caused significant dispersion. Rockets landed miles from their intended targets, and German intelligence had no reliable way to assess accuracy. They relied on two sources: aerial reconnaissance, which was limited by weather and Allied air superiority, and intelligence reports from agents in Britain. German intelligence believed it had agents operating in London who could observe and report where rockets landed. It did not. All German agents in Britain had been captured and turned by MI5. They were controlled assets, transmitting reports written by British intelligence. MI5 saw an opportunity. If Germany could be deceived about where the V-2s were landing, the deception might influence future targeting, potentially shifting impacts away from central London. The plan, code named the WWII Weapon Misinformation Campaign, used double agents to feed false impact reports to Germany. The agents reported that rockets were overshooting central London, landing in northern and northwestern suburbs. The reports were detailed and convincing: specific streets, damage descriptions, casualty estimates. The goal was to encourage German engineers to reduce range, shorten fuel loads, or adjust launch angles, so rockets would fall short, landing in less densely populated areas south and east of central London. The ethics were brutal. If the deception worked, it would shift rocket impacts from one neighborhood to another, from wealthier central and western districts toward poorer eastern and southern suburbs. People would die either way. The question was where and in what numbers. British intelligence calculated that central London's population density was higher, so shifting impacts outward might reduce overall casualties. But the evidence of the campaign's effectiveness is contested. Post-war analysis of German V-2 records and British damage reports shows some correlation between double agent reports and subsequent German range adjustments. But the adjustments were small, the dispersion of impacts was large, and other factors, mechanical issues, changing launch sites, Allied bombing of production facilities, also affected targeting. Some historians argue the deception saved lives by shifting a measurable number of rockets away from central London. Others argue the effect was marginal, that V-2 impacts were already widely scattered, and that the campaign's main achievement was giving British intelligence a sense of agency in a situation where they otherwise had no control. The moral question remained unresolved. Did British intelligence have the right to shift danger from one civilian population to another? Were the people of East London less deserving of protection than those in Westminster? The decision-makers justified the campaign on utilitarian grounds, fewer total casualties, but the ethical weight was real. The V2 campaign ended in March 1945, when Allied ground forces overran German launch sites in the Netherlands and Belgium. The last V2 to hit Britain fell on March 27, 1945, in Orpington, Kent, killing one person. Over 3,000 V2s had been launched during the campaign against Britain, Belgium, France, and other targets. The rockets killed thousands, destroyed infrastructure, and demonstrated that future wars would be fought with weapons capable of striking cities from hundreds of miles away. The V2 was a technological marvel and a strategic failure. It consumed enormous resources, slave labor, precision engineering, rare materials, and delivered relatively little military impact. The resources spent on weapons might have produced thousands of additional fighter aircraft or tanks, which would have been far more effective in defending Germany from invasion. But the V2's legacy extended beyond the war. After Germany's defeat, both the United States and Soviet Union seized V2 technology, rockets, and engineers. Wernher von Braun, the chief designer of the V2, surrendered to American forces and was brought to the United States, where he eventually led the development of America's space program. The V2 became the foundation for Cold War ballistic missiles and ultimately space exploration. In London, the craters were filled, the rubble cleared, and the buildings rebuilt. The double agents who transmitted the false reports were debriefed, thanked, and released from service. The records of the deception were classified, buried in MI5 archives, emerging only decades later when historians began studying the ethical and operational dimensions of wartime intelligence. The campaign illustrated a recurring dilemma in the invisible war. Intelligence can shape outcomes, but the outcomes involve human lives, and the choices are rarely clean. Shifting rocket impacts, feeding false information, manipulating enemy targeting, all were legitimate military operations under the laws of war, but they required someone to decide whose neighborhood would burn, whose street would be hit, and whose children would die. The V2 stopped falling. The war moved east, and the invisible war's final chapter began to close, leaving behind questions about what had been justified, what had been necessary, and what had simply been done because it could be. Chapter 22. Also hunting a secret, the team moved fast, following just behind advancing Allied armies, racing against time and secrecy. They were not combat soldiers, though some carried weapons. They were scientists, intelligence officers, and specialists tasked with a single mission: find Germany's atomic research, secure its materials, and capture its scientists before the Soviets did. The mission was code-named Alsos, Greek for Grove, a reference to General Leslie Groves, military director of the Manhattan Project, America's atomic bomb program. Alsos was created in late 1943 to investigate German progress toward nuclear weapons and to deny that progress to any post-war adversary. The fear driving Alsos was existential. If Germany had developed, or was close to developing, an atomic bomb, the strategic calculus of the war would invert overnight. A single bomb could destroy a city, kill hundreds of thousands, and render invasion impossible. Intelligence suggested Germany had the scientific talent, Werner Heisenberg, Otto Hahn, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, and access to uranium from occupied Czechoslovakia and Norway. But how far had Germany progressed? Alsos teams entered liberated France in mid-1944, visiting universities and industrial sites, searching for evidence of nuclear research. They found traces, laboratories, records of experiments, references to scientific meetings, but nothing suggesting a large-scale weapons program. As Allied forces advanced into Belgium and the Netherlands, Alsos followed, interrogating scientists, seizing documents, and tracking shipments of rare materials. The breakthrough came in late 1944, when Alsos reached Strasbourg, recently liberated from German occupation. In the office of a German physicist, Alsos agents found correspondence, research notes, and bureaucratic records documenting Germany's nuclear program, code-named the Uranverenes Uranium Club. The documents revealed that Germany had pursued atomic research, but had not achieved a self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction, had not developed a viable bomb design, and was years behind the Manhattan Project. The relief was immediate. Germany did not have an atomic bomb, but the mission was not finished. Alsace still needed to secure Germany's nuclear materials, capture key scientists, and prevent Soviet forces, advancing from the east, from seizing the same assets. In April 1945, Alsace identified a critical target, Hagelock, a small town in southwestern Germany, where German scientists had constructed an experimental nuclear reactor inside a cave. The reactor, hidden in a rock cellar beneath a church, was the final attempt by Heisenberg's team to achieve a chain reaction before the war ended. Alsace reached Hagelock on April 23, 1945, hours ahead of French forces. The team entered the cave, dismantled the reactor, and seized over 1.5 tons of uranium cubes, Germany's entire remaining stock of processed uranium. The material was packed into crates and shipped to the United States, ensuring it could not be used by anyone else. Over the following weeks, Alsace captured the key German nuclear scientists. Heisenberg was arrested on May 3, 1945, near Munich. Otto Hahn was captured shortly after. In total, 10 leading German physicists were detained and secretly transported to England, where they were held at Farm Hall, a country estate converted into a detention and surveillance facility. The scientists were treated well, comfortable accommodations, access to books and newspapers, allowed to interact freely. But the house was bugged. MI6 had hidden microphones in every room, recording the scientists' conversations. The goal was to assess what the Germans knew, what they had achieved, and whether they understood why they had failed. The recordings captured the scientists' shock when they learned, in August 1945, that the United States had dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Some refused to believe it. Others were humiliated, embarrassed that they had failed while their Allied counterparts had succeeded. Heisenberg, in conversations recorded at Farm Hall, attempted to rationalize the failure, suggesting that German scientists had deliberately slowed progress because they did not want to give Hitler an atomic weapon. The claim was contested, both by fellow scientists and by historians analyzing the evidence. The post-war consensus, based on Alsace's findings and German records, was that Germany's nuclear program failed for structural and strategic reasons, not moral ones. The program was underfunded, fragmented across competing institutions, hampered by the loss of Jewish scientists who had fled Nazi persecution, and deprioritized by German military leadership who did not believe atomic weapons could be developed in time to affect the war. But Alsace's mission revealed a broader strategic reality. The race for advanced weapons did not end with Germany's defeat. It accelerated into the post-war world. The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union all sought German scientists, technologies, and knowledge. Alsace was only one part of a larger scramble to secure strategic assets before adversaries could. The Soviet Union, advancing into Eastern Germany, captured uranium processing facilities, scientific records, and scientists who had not been evacuated west. These resources contributed to the Soviet atomic bomb program, which successfully tested its first weapon in 1940, 9 years earlier than Western intelligence had predicted. The consequence of Alsace was dual. It confirmed that Germany had not developed an atomic bomb, relieving the immediate fear, and it secured materials and knowledge that accelerated American nuclear dominance in the early Cold War. But it also marked the transition from wartime cooperation to post-war competition. Allies during the war, adversaries after, racing to control the technologies that would define the next conflict. The scientists at Farm Hall were eventually released and returned to Germany, where they resumed academic careers, worked on peaceful nuclear research, and lived with the knowledge that they had been recorded, assessed, and found wanting. Heisenberg became a symbol of the moral ambiguity of science in wartime. A brilliant physicist who worked for a genocidal regime, but claimed he had sabotaged his own work to prevent Hitler from obtaining the ultimate weapon. Whether that claim was true or a post-war rationalization remained debated among historians. The uranium seized at Hagelock was incorporated into American stockpiles. The documents captured by Alsace were analyzed, translated, and archived, and the invisible war, which had been fought with codes and deception, transitioned into a new phase, fought with espionage technology and the struggle to control knowledge itself. Chapter 23. The spy war inside the Alliance. The laboratories sat on a remote mesa in New Mexico, surrounded by desert and barbed wire. Los Alamos, the heart of the Manhattan Project, was where the world's first atomic bomb was designed, tested, and built. Security was absolute, or so the Americans believed. Visitors were screened, mail was censored, phones were tapped, and movements were tracked. The scientists working there, among the most brilliant minds of the 20th century, were isolated from the outside world, forbidden to discuss their work, and constantly reminded that secrecy was a matter of national survival. But secrets were leaking. Soviet intelligence had penetrated the Manhattan Project at multiple levels. Agents operated inside Los Alamos, inside British research teams, and within the political and administrative circles that oversaw the program. The espionage was systematic, patient, and devastatingly effective. One of the most damaging agents was Klaus Fuchs, a German-born British physicist who had fled Nazi Germany and was recruited to work on British atomic research. In 1943, he was sent to the United States as part of the British delegation to the Manhattan Project. Fuchs was brilliant, trusted, and ideologically committed to communism. He believed that the Soviet Union, an ally in the fight against fascism, deserved access to atomic knowledge to balance post-war power. Fuchs passed detailed technical information to Soviet intelligence, designs for the plutonium implosion bomb, calculations for the explosive lenses that compressed the core, and data on uranium enrichment. He met with his Soviet handler, Harry Gold, in covert locations, street corners, public parks, private apartments, and handed over documents that would save the Soviet atomic program years of research and experimentation. Another agent, David Greenglass, worked as a machinist at Los Alamos. He had access to technical drawings and engineering plans. His handler was his brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg, who ran a Soviet espionage network in the United States. Greenglass sketched components from memory and passed them to Rosenberg, who forwarded them to Soviet intelligence through courier chains. The espionage was not limited to Los Alamos. Theodore Hall, a young physicist working on bomb design, independently approached Soviet intelligence and offered his services. He provided critical information on the implosion design without being formally recruited, espionage motivated by ideology, not coercion. American and British counterintelligence were aware that leaks were occurring but struggled to identify the sources. Security procedures were tightened, but the challenge was immense. Los Alamos employed thousands of scientists, engineers, and support staff. Screening everyone was impossible, and the culture of scientific openness, essential to research, conflicted with the need for absolute secrecy. The breakthrough came not through traditional counterintelligence, but through signals intelligence. In 1940, 3 U.S. Army cryptanalysts began a secret program to intercept and decrypt Soviet diplomatic communications. The program later code, named WWII, Soviet messages were encrypted using one-time pads, theoretically unbreakable, but errors in Soviet cryptographic procedures, reused key pages, created vulnerabilities. The decryption was agonizingly slow. Analysts worked for years on fragments of messages, piecing together words, phrases, and code names. But by the late 1940s, WWII intercepts had identified Soviet agents operating inside the Manhattan Project. The intercepts did not always provide full names, but they contained enough detail, code names, meeting locations, descriptions of materials passed, to narrow the search. Klaus Fuchs was identified in 1949, arrested, and confessed. He was tried in Britain, convicted of espionage, and sentenced to 14 years in prison. He served 9, was released, and moved to East Germany, where he continued working as a physicist until his death in 1988. David Greenglass was identified and arrested in 1950. He confessed and testified against his brother-in-law Julius Rosenberg and Rosenberg's wife, Ethel Rosenberg. The Rosenbergs were tried for espionage, convicted, and executed in 1953, the only American civilians executed for espionage during the Cold War. The case was controversial, with debates over whether Ethel Rosenberg was actively involved in espionage or primarily guilty by association, and whether the death penalty was justified. Theodore Hall was identified through WWII intercepts but never prosecuted. The US government chose not to reveal WWII's existence publicly, fearing that exposure would compromise ongoing signals intelligence operations. Hall lived quietly in the United States, his espionage unknown to the public until the 1990s, when Vienna documents were declassified. He died in 1999, having never been charged. The consequence of Soviet espionage inside the Manhattan Project was strategic. The intelligence accelerated Soviet atomic bomb development. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic weapon on August 29, 1949, years earlier than American intelligence had predicted. The knowledge stolen by Fuchs, Greenglass, Hall, and others did not give the Soviets the bomb outright. They still needed to build industrial infrastructure, refine materials, and test designs, but it saved them years of trial and error. The espionage also reshaped the post-war alliance. Wartime cooperation between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union fractured over atomic secrecy. The US had attempted to keep atomic knowledge from the Soviets, believing that monopoly on nuclear weapons would provide strategic leverage. The revelation that the Soviets had spied on the program deepened mistrust and accelerated the arms race. The ethical dimension was complex. The spies, Fuchs, Hall, Greenglass, believed they were acting morally, balancing power to prevent American hegemony and reduce the risk of nuclear war. They saw themselves as idealists, not traitors. But the consequence of their actions was to enable a totalitarian regime to acquire weapons of mass destruction, contributing to decades of Cold War tension and the proliferation of nuclear arsenals capable of destroying civilization. The Invisible War, which had been fought against Nazi Germany, continued without pause against a former ally. The tools shifted: espionage networks, signals intelligence, defections, but the stakes remained existential, and the realization settled over intelligence agencies worldwide. The war had not ended in 1945. It had simply changed enemies, methods, and theaters. In Los Alamos, the laboratories continued operating, producing weapons, refining designs, and training the scientists who would build the arsenals of the Cold War. The MESA was no longer isolated. The secrets it held had already traveled, copied onto microfilm, memorized, passed through courier chains, and delivered to Moscow, where Soviet scientists studied them and built their own bombs. The race for atomic dominance began not after the war, but during it, hidden inside the alliance, carried out by people who believed they were serving a higher cause. And the cost, measured in decades of nuclear brinkmanship, was a legacy that would haunt the world long after the last veteran of World War II had died. Chapter 24. Venona begins. The intercepts were radio signals, bursts of 5-digit number groups transmitted from Soviet diplomatic and trade offices in New York, Washington, San Francisco, and other cities, directed to Moscow. They were encrypted using one-time pads, cipher systems considered mathematically unbreakable if used correctly. Each message was encrypted with a unique key that was never reused. Without the key, decryption was impossible. But the Soviets made mistakes. In February 1943, a small team of US Army cryptanalysts, working under the Signal Intelligence Service, later absorbed into the National Security Agency, began a project to collect and analyze Soviet encrypted communications. The initial goal was not necessarily to decrypt the messages, but to study traffic patterns, identify communication networks, and understand Soviet intelligence operations. The project, eventually code-named Vienna, operated in absolute secrecy. Even within the US intelligence community, knowledge of Vienna was restricted to a handful of senior officials. The British were brought into the project in 1945, sharing technical expertise and resources. But the existence of the program was not revealed to the Soviet Union or even to many American policymakers. The breakthrough came in the late 1940s, when cryptanalysts discovered that Soviet cipher clerks, under pressure to produce one-time pads quickly during the war, had reused key pages. The reuse was inconsistent. Some pages were used once, others 2 or more times, but the repetitions created patterns that could be exploited. If 2 messages were encrypted with the same key, analysts could compare them, subtract one from the other, and recover fragments of plaintext. The work was grueling. Messages were analyzed character by character, compared against thousands of other messages, tested against probable word lists, and cross-referenced with known Soviet code names and phrases. A single message might take months or years to partially decrypt. Many messages were never fully broken, but the fragments that were decrypted revealed an intelligence catastrophe: Soviet espionage networks operating across the United States, Britain, Canada, and other allied nations. The intercepts identified agents by code name, described meetings, referenced materials passed, and outlined the structure of Soviet intelligence operations. WWII intercepts confirmed or identified Soviet agents including Klaus Fuchs code named RST and CASRES Julius and Ethel Rosenberg's GERIBURL and ETHL Theodore Hall's code named MLAD and dozens of others. The intercepts also revealed the scale of Soviet penetration into Allied governments, military services, and scientific programs. The intelligence from WWII was used to guide counterintelligence investigations, but was not introduced as evidence in most espionage trials. The US government feared that revealing WWII's existence would expose American signals intelligence capabilities, alert the Soviets to their cryptographic errors, and compromise ongoing intelligence collection. As a result, prosecutions relied on confessions, physical evidence, and witness testimony, while WWII remained hidden. The secrecy surrounding WWII lasted decades. The program was not publicly acknowledged until 1995, 52 years after it began, when the NSA declassified and released portions of the WWII archive. The release transformed historical understanding of Cold War espionage, confirming the existence of extensive Soviet intelligence networks and validating many, though not all, accusations made during the McCarthy era. The ethical and political implications were profound. WWII provided evidence that some of the individuals accused of espionage during the Red Scare were, in fact, guilty. But it also showed that not everyone accused was guilty, and that the evidence was often fragmentary, ambiguous, or misinterpreted. The declassification of WWII reopened historical debates about loyalty, ideology, and the boundaries of acceptable dissent during wartime and the early Cold War. The consequence of WWII was multi-layered. Operationally, it allowed US and British counterintelligence to identify and neutralize Soviet agents. Historically, it reshaped understanding of Soviet espionage and the extent of penetration into Allied institutions. Politically, it complicated Cold War narratives, providing evidence that espionage was real and widespread, but also showing that intelligence, even when accurate, could be weaponized for political purposes. WWII also illustrated the limits of signals intelligence. Despite years of effort, many intercepts were never decrypted. The program required enormous resources: cryptanalysts, linguists, analysts, computational support, and produced results slowly. The intelligence was retrospective. WWII identified agents years after their operations had concluded, too late to prevent the damage, but in time to inform counterintelligence and prosecution. The Invisible War, which had been fought with Enigma, ULTRA, and deception operations during World War II, transitioned seamlessly into the Cold War, fought with WWII defectors and the espionage networks that crisscrossed the ideological divide. The methods evolved, the targets changed, but the fundamental struggle, control of information, manipulation of perception, and the hunt for secrets, remained constant. In the cryptanalysis centers, the work continued for decades. Analysts pored over intercepts, tested hypotheses, and slowly extracted meaning from encrypted noise. The messages, transmitted in wartime, decrypted in peacetime, and released to historians generations later, documented a hidden dimension of the 20th century. A war fought in shadows, where victory was measured not in territory, but in knowledge, and where the consequences shaped global politics for half a century. Chapter 25, Files, Trials, and the Afterlife of Secrets. The files filled entire buildings. In May 1945, as Allied forces advanced into the heart of Germany, intelligence teams raced to secure archives before they could be destroyed or seized by rival forces. They found warehouses packed with documents, Gestapo interrogation records, Abwehr operational files, SD surveillance logs, concentration camp administration, and the bureaucratic machinery of the Nazi state. The captured German documents section, established by the Allies, began the painstaking work of cataloging, translating, and analyzing millions of pages. The files documented not only military operations, but the invisible war espionage networks, deception operations, counterintelligence investigations, and the fates of agents who had operated across occupied Europe. Some discoveries were strategic. Files on the Red Orchestra revealed the extent of Soviet penetration into German military and industrial circles. Records of the Abwehr's operations in Britain confirmed that MI5's double-cross system had successfully controlled or eliminated every German agent on British soil. Interrogation transcripts documented the capture and execution of SOE operatives, providing grim confirmation of networks that had gone silent. Other discoveries were deeply personal. Families of missing agents, who had waited years for word, found confirmation in German records, arrest dates, interrogation summaries, execution orders. The files turned absences into certainties, hope into documented loss. But the archives also presented a dilemma: what to reveal and what to conceal. The Allied intelligence services, particularly British MI5-6 and the American OSS, faced a choice. Some captured documents exposed intelligence methods, code-breaking double-agent networks, deception techniques that remained operationally useful in the emerging Cold War. Revealing those methods would educate adversaries, particularly the Soviet Union, which was rapidly transitioning from wartime ally to peacetime competitor. The decision was made: classify and sanitize. Documents that exposed sources and methods were seized, reclassified, and buried in intelligence archives, unavailable to the public, historians, or even most government officials. The Nuremberg trials, which prosecuted Nazi war criminals, used selectively chosen evidence. Intelligence that might reveal Allied capabilities was omitted, even if it would have strengthened the prosecution's case. The consequence was a fractured historical record. The public understanding of the war, shaped by official histories and news coverage, excluded the invisible war almost entirely. ELTRA, the double-cross system, SOE operations, VNINA, all remained classified. Veterans who had worked in signals intelligence, deception, or espionage were bound by secrecy oaths and could not speak publicly about their service. Families of fallen agents were told only that their loved ones had died in service to their country, without details, honors, or acknowledgement. The trials themselves became theaters of selective truth. At Nuremberg, German intelligence officers testified about their operations, sometimes revealing details the Allies preferred to keep secret. The prosecution carefully managed what evidence was introduced, ensuring that German testimony did not inadvertently expose Allied intelligence successes. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, did not stand trial. He had been executed by the Nazis in April 1945, hanged at Flossenbjerg concentration camp for his role in the July 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler. Post-war analysis of Canaris's wartime activities revealed a complex figure, an intelligence chief who had run operations against the Allies while simultaneously tolerating or enabling resistance within his own organization. Whether Canaris had been a secret opponent of Hitler or simply an opportunist hedging his bets remained debated. Otto Skorzeny, the commando who led Operation Grafe, was tried for violations of the laws of war. His defense argued that wearing enemy uniforms for infiltration was a legitimate ruse de guerre, as long as combatants removed the uniforms before fighting. The tribunal acquitted him, setting a precedent that shaped post-war interpretations of unconventional warfare. But many intelligence operatives were never tried. German scientists and intelligence officers deemed useful were quietly recruited by the United States, Britain, or the Soviet Union under programs like Operation Paperclip, US and equivalent Soviet efforts. Their wartime activities were overlooked or sanitized in exchange for their knowledge and cooperation. The invisible war's participants transitioned from enemies to assets, their secrets traded for post-war advantage. The consequence was institutional and moral. Intelligence agencies, having proven their value during the war, were not disbanded but expanded. The OSS was dissolved in 1945, but its functions were absorbed into the Strategic Services Unit and eventually the CIA. British intelligence services continued, adapting wartime methods to Cold War challenges. The Soviet NKVDs, later KGB, grew in power and reach. The lesson absorbed by governments worldwide was clear: intelligence is not a wartime luxury, but a permanent necessity. The invisible war would not end. It would continue indefinitely, fought between former allies, using methods perfected against a common enemy. For the families of agents, the archives provided closure but no comfort. They learned how their loved ones had died, interrogated, tortured, executed. But the deaths remained classified, unmarked by public memorials or official recognition. The sacrifices were recorded in files that few would ever read, acknowledged only in internal intelligence histories that would remain secret for decades. The captured files filled warehouses in Washington, London, and Moscow. They were indexed, translated, analyzed, and locked away. Some were released decades later, after Cold War sensitivities faded. Others remain classified, their contents deemed too sensitive even now. Over 80 years after the war's end, the Invisible Wars Archive became its own secret, a record of a conflict fought in shadows, preserved in locked rooms, accessible only to those with clearance, shaping our understanding of history while remaining hidden from the history it shaped. Chapter 26. The cost paid by agents. The wireless operator sat in a darkened room in a Paris apartment, headphones pressed to her ears, tapping out Morse code on a transmitter the size of a suitcase. Her fingers moved quickly. Speed was survival. Every transmission was a risk. German direction-finding vans roamed the city, triangulating signals, closing in on clandestine radios. She was 23 years old, recruited by WWII, trained in England, parachuted into France, and tasked with maintaining contact between London and the resistance network in Paris. Her code name was Mehdi Lion. Her real name was Noor Inayat Khan. She transmitted for 4 months before she was betrayed. A French collaborator sold her location to the Gestapo for money. On October 13, 1943, Gestapo officers knocked on her door. She tried to escape through a window but was caught on the rooftop. She fought, scratching, biting, refusing to cooperate. They beat her unconscious and dragged her to Gestapo headquarters at 84 Avenue Foch. The interrogation lasted months. The Gestapo wanted names, codes, safe houses, and contacts. Noor refused to provide anything. She was held in chains, beaten repeatedly, and eventually transferred to Pforzheim prison in Germany, where she was kept in solitary confinement, shackled and subjected to further interrogation. On September 13, 1944, Noor Inayat Khan was transported to Dachau concentration camp. She was 29 years old. At dawn, she and 3 other female WWII agents, Yolande Beekman, Eliane Pluman, and Madeleine Damament, were taken to the crematorium, forced to kneel, and shot in the back of the head. Their bodies were burned in the crematorium ovens. No grave, no marker, no record except the execution log. She was not the only one. Violette Szabó, a British-French WWII agent, parachuted into France twice. On her second mission in June 1944, she was captured in a firefight with German forces near Limoges. She was interrogated at Gestapo headquarters, tortured, and sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp, where she was executed by firing squad in late January or early February 1940, 5 weeks before the camp's liberation. Odette Sansom, captured in France in 1943, survived. She endured torture. Her toenails were pulled out, her spine was burned with a hot iron, but she did not break. She maintained a cover story, claiming to be married to a British officer and protected by familial connections to Winston Churchill, a lie, but one the Gestapo partially believed. She was sent to Ravensbrück, UK, and held in solitary confinement. In April 1945, as Allied forces closed in, the camp commandant, hoping to use her as a bargaining chip, handed her over to American forces. She survived, one of the few. The cost paid by agents was measured in individual lives, but the scale was collective. WWII alone deployed over 13,000 agents into occupied Europe. Approximately 3,200 died, captured, executed, killed in action, or dead from the consequences of their service. The mortality rate was nearly 25%, higher than many frontline combat units. The work demanded endurance of a kind not measured in battles. Agents lived under false identities, knowing that a single mistake, a wrong accent, a forgotten detail, a moment of inattention could lead to arrest. They operated alone or in small groups, without support backup, or the structures of military discipline. When captured, they faced interrogation by professionals trained to extract information through pain, fear, and psychological manipulation. Some agents carried pills, cyanide capsules, as a final escape. The pills were voluntary, not everyone carried them, but their existence acknowledged the reality. Interrogation could break anyone given enough time, and some information was too valuable to risk revealing. The techniques used by German interrogators were systematic. Physical torture, beatings, burns, electric shocks, was common but not universal. Psychological methods were often more effective: isolation, sleep deprivation, false promises of leniency, threats against family members, manipulation of hope and despair. Interrogators studied captured agents, identified vulnerabilities, and exploited them. Some agents broke quickly, others endured for weeks or months. A few, like Noor Inayat Khan and Odette Sansom, refused to cooperate at all, even when cooperation might have saved their lives. Their resistance was not superhuman. It was ordinary people pushed to extraordinary limits, making choices under conditions no training could fully prepare them for. The consequences of capture extended beyond the individual. When an agent broke under interrogation, they might reveal safe houses, contact procedures, codes, or the identities of other agents. German counterintelligence used the information to roll up entire networks, arresting dozens of operatives in coordinated sweeps. The captured agents were then faced with the knowledge that their suffering had led to the suffering of others. A psychological burden that some never escaped, even if they survived. After the war, the survivors returned to civilian life carrying experiences they could not share. Many suffered from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Nightmares, flashbacks, survivor's guilt, relationships fractured. Some agents drank heavily, self-medicated, or withdrew into silence. The recognition they received was delayed and inadequate. WWII was disbanded in 1946, its records classified, its agents' contributions unacknowledged publicly for decades. Memorials came slowly. In 1948, a plaque was unveiled at WWII headquarters commemorating those who had died. In the 1950s and 1960s, individual stories began to emerge as families published memoirs or WWII veterans wrote accounts. But full recognition did not come until the 2000s, when archives were finally declassified and historians reconstructed the operational details of networks, missions, and sacrifices. Noor Inayat Khan was posthumously awarded the George Cross, Britain's highest civilian honor for bravery. Violet Szabo received the same. Odette Sansom was awarded the George Cross and survived to see her story told in books and films. But for every named agent whose story became known, dozens remained anonymous. Names in classified files, bodies in unmarked graves, or simply disappeared, their fates uncertain even now. The cost was human, specific, and permanent. The wireless operators who transmitted until the direction-finding vans arrived. The couriers who carried messages across occupied territory, knowing a random checkpoint could be their end. The saboteurs who placed explosives and hoped the timers were set correctly. The organizers who built networks, knowing that every person they recruited was a person they might doom. They were not abstractions. They were people, young, old, men, women from a dozen nations, who volunteered, trained, deployed, and often died, carrying secrets that would outlive them, buried in archives and memory. Chapter 27. What deception changed war is fought twice, once on the battlefield with steel and flesh, and once in the mind of the enemy with information and lies. The invisible war of World War II proved that the second fight could shape the first, that deception, systematically applied, could move divisions, delay reinforcements, and alter outcomes as decisively as artillery or airstrikes. The measurable effects were documented in post-war analysis. At El Alamein, deception caused Rommel to misposition his reserves, costing the Axis time and casualties during the critical opening phase of the British offensive. At Sicily, Operation Mincemeat diverted German troops to Sardinia and Greece, reducing resistance on the actual landing beaches. At Normandy, Operation Fortitude held the German 15th Army in Pas de Calais for 7 weeks after D-Day, buying the Allies time to build up forces and break out of the beachhead. Historians have attempted to quantify the impact. One frequently cited estimate, based on Allied operational analysis, suggests that deception operations during D-Day and the Normandy campaign saved tens of thousands of Allied lives by reducing the strength of German counterattacks and delaying the commitment of reserves. The estimate is necessarily imprecise. Warfare does not offer controlled experiments, but the pattern is consistent where deception succeeded. Casualties were lower and objectives were achieved faster. But the consequences were not only tactical. Deception changed doctrine. Before World War II, military deception was an art practiced informally, inconsistently, and often ineffectively. By 1945, it had become a science codified in manuals, taught in training schools, and integrated into operational planning at the highest levels. The British and Americans institutionalized deception. The London Controlling Section became a permanent feature of the British intelligence architecture, operating through the Cold War. The United States military established deception units and doctrines that persist into the present. The lesson absorbed was that every major operation should include a deception plan, and that deception required the same resources, planning, and coordination as conventional operations. The psychological consequences were subtler but pervasive. Deception weaponized trust. The double-cross system turned German confidence in its own intelligence networks into a vulnerability. WWII, the double agent awarded the Iron Cross by Germany, demonstrated that trust, once established, could be exploited to deliver falsehoods more damaging than any act of sabotage. But this weaponization of trust had costs. In the post-war world, intelligence agencies became institutions of suspicion. The assumption that the enemy might be lying about capabilities, intentions, locations, became embedded in strategic culture. Verification replaced trust. Every report was questioned. Every source was assessed for reliability and possible deception. The Invisible War's legacy was a world where certainty was rare and paranoia was rational. Deception also shaped the ethics of warfare, using corpses as props, feeding false information that shifted bombing targets toward different civilian areas, creating panic through infiltration. All raised questions about acceptable methods. Where was the line between legitimate military deception and manipulation that crossed moral boundaries? The wartime answer was utilitarian. If deception saved more lives than it cost, it was justified. But the calculus was never clean. Deception operations involved choices about whose lives mattered more, whose neighborhoods would be bombed, whose suffering was acceptable in service of a larger goal. Those choices were made in secret by small groups of officers and intelligence planners, without public debate or accountability. After the war, the ethical questions were largely buried alongside the operational details. Deception was celebrated in sanitized histories as clever, innovative, and effective, but the uncomfortable specifics were downplayed or omitted. The full record remained classified for decades, limiting public debate about what had been done and whether it should ever be done again. The technological legacy was equally significant. Deception operations drove innovation in camouflage, dummy equipment, electronic warfare, and psychological operations. Techniques developed to fool aerial reconnaissance, radar, and radio intercept were refined and carried forward into the Cold War, later conflicts, and modern warfare. The inflatable tanks that deceived the Germans at Normandy evolved into sophisticated decoys, thermal, radar, and acoustic, that remain in military arsenals today. The radio deception practiced by the Ghost Army became a foundation of electronic warfare, jamming, spoofing, and manipulating enemy sensors. The psychological operations pioneered during the war shaped modern influence campaigns, both military and political. But perhaps the deepest consequence was conceptual. Deception became normalized. In popular memory, shaped by post-war films, books, and histories, the Invisible War was often portrayed as a romantic contest of wits. The reality, interrogation, execution, moral compromise, and the manipulation of perception was less comfortable and less frequently told. The result was a cultural legacy that celebrated deception uncritically, often ignoring its costs and complexities. The Invisible War became myth, and the myth shaped how later conflicts were understood and justified. If deception had worked so well once, why not apply it everywhere? The logic was seductive and dangerous. The maps that showed phantom divisions, the radio traffic that simulated armies that did not exist, the agents who fed lies back to enemy capitals, all were archived, studied, and emulated. The Invisible War did not end in 1945. It continued, refined, and expanded into every conflict that followed. And the question remained unanswered. If victory depends on lies, what happens when the lies become permanent? Chapter 28. Epilogue. When the silence lifted for 30 years, the Invisible War remained invisible. Veterans returned from Bletchley Park, from SO East stations, from OSIS missions, and said nothing. They went back to universities, law firms, government offices, and quiet lives. Friends and family asked what they had done during the war, and they deflected clerical work, filing, nothing worth talking about. They carried secrets into marriages, careers, and old age, bound by the Official Secrets Act and by promises made in wartime. The files stayed locked, Governments classified everything: code-breaking records, double agent files, deception plans, captured enemy archives. The justification was Cold War necessity, revealing methods would educate new adversaries. The consequence was historical distortion. Public histories written in the 1950s and 1960s explained battles without the intelligence that shaped them. Victories were attributed to tactics and bravery alone, with no mention of the invisible war that made them possible. The first crack appeared in 1974, when a former British intelligence officer published a book revealing the existence of wartime codebreaking and its impact. The disclosure stunned historians and veterans alike. Much of what was believed about the war was suddenly incomplete. Partial declassification followed. Over the next decades, records were released, allowing campaigns to be reassessed through the lens of intelligence. The Battle of the Atlantic, North Africa, and Normandy were reinterpreted with new evidence. But the process was slow and selective. Full access to some archives did not come until the 1990s. Others remain closed even now. The release of Cold War intercepts in 1995 further reshaped understanding, confirming extensive espionage within wartime alliances. The timing was deliberate. The geopolitical rationale for secrecy had faded, and the risk of exposure had diminished. Files on wartime agents began opening in the 2000s, often after decades of pressure from historians and families. Long silent cases were resolved. Families learned, sometimes 60 or 70 years later, how their loved ones had died. The declassifications enabled a reckoning. Intelligence contributions were acknowledged. Veterans, many elderly or already gone, were finally recognized. Memorials were built. Honors were awarded posthumously. The invisible war entered public memory at last, but the process also exposed the cost of silence. Many agents died without acknowledgement. Technical achievements were hidden for decades, distorting entire fields of history. Failures and ethical compromises remained less visible than successes. Popular culture often romanticized what was revealed, portraying the invisible war as clever and clean. The reality, fear, betrayal, torture, execution, was harder to dramatize and easier to ignore. Historians working through the archives told a more complicated story. Intelligence mattered, but it did not win the war alone. It shaped decisions, delayed enemies, and saved lives, but it required soldiers, sailors, and airmen to translate advantage into victory. The invisible war was a force multiplier, not a substitute for force. Its final legacy was institutional. Intelligence agencies became permanent instruments of state power. Wartime secrecy became peacetime habit. Methods refined against one enemy were redeployed against others. The invisible war did not end, it changed shape, and something was lost in the silence. Veterans who died before their work was acknowledged. Families who grieved without answers. Ethical debates that never happened because the facts were hidden. When the silence finally lifted, it revealed not only triumphs but costs, measured in lives, secrecy, and decades of misunderstanding. The archives remain. Some files are still closed. Some secrets died with the people who carried them. But enough has been revealed to understand the shape of the invisible war, to honor those who fought it, and to recognize that the lies, codes, and deceptions that shaped World War II also shaped the world that followed. A world where intelligence is power, secrecy is strategy, and the boundary between truth and deception remains fragile, contested, and essential. The war ended in 1945. The invisible war continues.